She had 12 years of silence stored in her body like scar tissue. 12 years of learning how to smile at the right moment, how to laugh at his jokes before they landed, how to make herself smaller so he could feel larger. Vivian Ashcombe had mastered the architecture of a perfect wife the way a prisoner masters the dimensions of her cell, completely, and without hope of ever needing that knowledge elsewhere. But tonight, standing in the middle of the imperial winter ball, while 500 pairs of eyes turned toward her like wolves scenting something wounded, she finally understood the one truth she had spent 12 years refusing to see. He had never loved her. He had only needed somewhere to put his ambition until it outgrew her. Enjoy it? The candles in the grand ballroom of Veltharan Palace burned at precisely the height they always burned. 3 feet of pale gold flame trembling in crystal sconces that ran the full length of the eastern wall, their reflections stretching across marble floors so polished that standing in this room felt like standing on the surface of a frozen lake. 500 nobles, 6 orchestras rotating in shifts so the music never stopped. Ice sculptures of imperial eagles carved to such detail you could count the individual feathers, already beginning to weep at their wingtips from the heat of so many bodies. The Winter Ball was the Empire's most theatrical performance, and everyone inside it understood their role implicitly. You were either ascending or you were decorating someone else's ascent. Vivian had been ascending for 12 years. She stood near the south colonnade in a gown the color of deep winter water, a blue so dark it read as black until candlelight caught the fabric and revealed something almost violent underneath. A shimmer of blue-green, like the bruised sky right before a storm breaks. The gown had cost 3 months of her personal household budget, and she had authorized the expenditure herself, which was one of the small freedoms Cedric had not yet thought to take from her. Her dark hair was pinned in an architectural coil at the nape of her neck with silver pins shaped like frost flowers. Her shoulders were bare. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had been told, at age 16, that the way you hold your spine is the first thing a room notices about you, and who had spent the subsequent 2 decades making sure rooms noticed the right thing. She looked, by every observable measure, like exactly what she was supposed to be, the Duchess of Blackthorn, wife of one of the 5 most powerful men in the Empire, hostess of the 2nd largest private estate in the Northern Territories, a woman of consequence. She did not look like a woman whose husband had stopped touching her 14 months ago. That particular piece of information lived in the same locked room inside her where she kept everything else she was not permitted to feel in public. The slow, grinding awareness of Cedric's coldness, the way he'd started holding conversations with her through his secretary rather than speaking to her directly, the dinner parties where he spoke across her as though she were part of the furniture. Handsome furniture, yes, well-maintained furniture, but furniture nonetheless. She had cataloged these changes the way you catalog symptoms when you suspect something is wrong with your body but cannot yet bring yourself to name the disease. The orchestra shifted from a Valdrossian waltz into something slower. Couples redistributed themselves across the floor. Vivian accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and turned slightly toward the room, performing the comfortable surveillance of a woman who belonged here, who had always belonged here, who would always belong here. She found Cedric across the room without even trying. She always found Cedric across the room without trying. 12 years of marriage had given her an involuntary awareness of his location in any shared space, a kind of peripheral magnetism that she suspected would outlast the marriage itself, if marriages could be outlasted, which she had been raised to believe they could not. He was standing near the imperial fireplace, which was large enough to roast an ox and currently occupied by a fire that cast moving gold light across everyone within 20 feet. He was tall. This was the first thing anyone said about Cedric Blackthorn. Always, he's a tall man, as though height were the foundational fact from which all other facts about him could be derived. He was 41, which sat well on him in the way it sits well on men who've spent their lives being accommodated by the world. His dark hair had silver at the temples now, and he wore it with the particular ease of a man who knows silver temples read as distinguished rather than aging. His formal coat was midnight blue with silver embroidery at the collar, House Blackthorn's colors, coincidentally echoing Vivian's gown, as the household seamstress had planned months ago when coordinating their dress for the evening. He was not looking at his wife. He was looking at Selina Vale, Vivian had known about Selina Vale for 4 months and 2 weeks. She knew the precise date because it had been the morning of her mother's birthday, a day she always spent in mild private grief, which meant she had spent that particular morning in her sitting room with her tea going cold while her lady's maid, a girl named Petra, with unfortunate loyalty and worse timing, made the stammering, visibly terrified confession that she'd seen the Duke entering Lady Vale's private chambers on 3 separate evenings during the autumn hunts at Castelmare. Petra had cried. Vivian had thanked her, dismissed her, and then sat very still for approximately 40 minutes, while the cold tea grew colder and the birthday grief transformed into something with sharper edges and no name she could readily access. She had not confronted Cedric. She had done the math instead, which was what Vivian always did when the emotional reality of a situation became too large to approach directly. She reduced it to its structural components and examined those. The math was not complicated. Cedric was sleeping with Selina Vale. Selina Vale was 26 years old, the younger daughter of a minor baron from the western provinces, possessed of extraordinary beauty and the particular social ambition that extraordinary beauty sometimes generates when it enters a room and realizes what rooms are for. She had arrived at court 18 months ago. She had been tactically kind to the right people. She had maneuvered herself into proximity with the right families. She had, apparently, maneuvered herself into proximity with Vivian's husband. The math, examined coldly, suggested that this was not an impulsive affair. It had the geometry of a plan. What Vivian had not been able to calculate, not yet, not with 4 months of data and the limited information available to a woman whose husband had begun routing all meaningful communication through intermediaries, was what the plan was for. What Cedric wanted from it. Because Cedric Blackthorne did not do things without wanting something from them. She had learned this about him in the first year of their marriage and spent the subsequent 11 confirming it with the thoroughness of a scientist who has already reached their conclusion but keeps running the experiment because the alternative is to stop running experiments. Now she watched him lean toward Selina Vale in the gold light of the imperial fireplace and say something that made Selina laugh. A laugh that was musical, controlled, and precisely calibrated to carry just far enough to be noticed without being obvious. And Vivian felt the math begin to rearrange itself into something new, something she wasn't ready to look at directly. She turned back toward the colonnade. "You've been standing in the same position for 11 minutes, said a voice beside her. "People will think you're a statue, a very expensive statue, but still." Vivian turned. Captain Rowan Hale stood 2 feet away, in his formal dress uniform of the Royal Guard. Deep crimson with gold at the shoulders, sword at his hip, dark hair cut close. The kind of face that looked younger than it was until you noticed the eyes, which did not look younger than anything. He was holding a glass of something amber that was definitely not the champagne being circulated by footmen, which meant he'd gone to the trouble of finding something better, which was very like him. "Rowan," she said. And then, because 12 years at court had made certain social reflexes completely automatic, "You look well." "I look like I'm being paid to be here, which I am," he said. He moved to stand beside her, facing the room the way she was facing the room. The two of them arranged in the posture of people having a casual conversation rather than a private one. "You, on the other hand, look like someone who is about to make a decision she hasn't made yet. That's a very specific observation. I've known you for 6 years, Vivian. I can read your face when you're thinking." "You can read when I'm thinking. That's different from knowing what I'm thinking." "Sure." He drank from his glass. "You're watching Cedric watch Selina Vale and you're deciding whether tonight is the night you do something about it or whether tonight is another night you don't." The orchestra reached the swell of whatever piece they were playing, violins climbing over each other toward a resolution that hadn't arrived yet. Across the room, Selina said something to Cedric. Cedric's expression shifted in the way it shifted when he was genuinely amused. Not the performed amusement he deployed socially, but the real thing, which was rare and therefore more legible when it appeared. Vivian had not made Cedric genuinely amused in longer than she could precisely remember. "He's going to make a move tonight," she said quietly. Not a question. Rowan was quiet for a beat. "What makes you say that?" "The way he's positioned himself. Near the fireplace, center of the room, maximum visibility. He's not conducting private business. He wants to be seen with her. And the way she's dressed." Vivian paused. "That's not a woman dressed for a winter ball. That's a woman dressed for a stage." Selina Vale was in gold, not the muted gold of conservative court fashion, pure, aggressive, unapologetic gold, a gown that caught every light source in the room and threw it back. Against Cedric's midnight blue, they composed a deliberate color statement. The household seamstress had coordinated Vivian and Cedric in matching colors. Someone had coordinated Cedric and Selina in complementary ones. "How long have you known?" Rowan asked. 4 months and... She stopped. "Long enough. And you haven't said anything to him." "I've been trying to understand what he wants first." Rowan turned his head slightly to look at her, which was a departure from their mutual pretense of watching the room. "Vivian, what he wants is obvious." "What's obvious is the affair," she said. "What's not obvious is the structure around the affair. Why now? Why this publicly? Why bring her to the winter ball, of all events?" She shook her head slightly. "Cedric doesn't do impulsive things. He builds them. Whatever tonight is, it's been built." Rowan said nothing, which, she had learned over 6 years, was what Rowan said when he knew something and had decided not to tell her. She looked at him directly. "You know something." "I know a lot of things. I'm the captain of the Royal Guard." "Rowan." He turned the amber glass in his hand once. "There have been conversations," he said carefully, "at a certain level of the court about the sustainability of certain noble houses and their current leadership structures." He paused. "That's as far as I'll take that sentence." The sentence was far enough. Conversations about the sustainability of noble houses. At a certain level of the court, which in practical terms meant people who had the emperor's ear, which meant this was not merely social gossip and not merely a personal affair. This was, in the vocabulary of the empire's political architecture, a restructuring conversation. And restructuring conversations about noble houses tended to require a predicate, a cause, a reason publicly legible enough to justify the redistribution of titles, lands, and power. The music shifted again. The dancers on the floor rearranged themselves for a new figure. Vivian understood, with the cold and complete clarity of a woman who had just finished running every possible mathematical permutation and arrived at the only remaining answer, what tonight was for. "He needs to remove me," she said, not loudly, not with visible emotion, the way you say a true thing that you've been refusing to say for months, once you finally say it, not with the weight of revelation, but with the exhausted flatness of confirmation. "Vivian, he needs to remove me, and he needs the removal to be clean, and it needs to be my fault." She was still watching the room. Her champagne glass had not moved. "If he simply sends me away or petitions for separation, there are provisions in the marriage contract. My family retains claim to part of the Blackthorn Northern estates. I have legal standing. It's complicated and potentially expensive." She paused. "But if I'm guilty of something, if there's a scandal, something irreversible..." She stopped again. The logic completed itself without her help. "Then there's nothing to negotiate." The silence between them had a particular weight. "How long have you been afraid of this specific thing?" Rowan asked. She thought about it honestly. "Since August, when I realized the conversations he was having with the palace solicitor's office were about estate law rather than contract law." She finally moved the champagne glass, took a sip, set it precisely back at her side. "I thought about approaching the Crown Prince's office. I thought about writing to my father." She shook her head. "I kept thinking I was being paranoid, that I was constructing a catastrophe from a collection of individually explainable things. You weren't being paranoid." "No." A beat. "I wasn't." The orchestra resolved its swell. The ballroom responded with the breath release of 300 guests who had been unconsciously holding something. And in that transitional moment, that half-second between musical phrases where the room's attention flickered and redistributed, Vivian saw Cedric look across the ballroom directly at her. Not at the space near her. Not in her general direction. At her. It was the longest he had looked at her in months, and it held something she recognized from very early in their marriage, a certain quality of calculation, a taking of measure, the look of a man evaluating whether the pieces on the board are arranged the way he needs them to be. Then his eyes moved away, back to Selina, and he leaned down and said something very quietly near her ear. Selina nodded. "I need you to go," Vivian said to Rowan. "What?" "I need you to walk away from me, right now. Go back to wherever you came from before you found me. Vivian, if something is about to happen, she said quietly, I need you to be as far away from me as this building allows. Go. Please. Rowan Hale was not a man who took orders from anyone below the rank of emperor as a general structural principle. He was also, in a category that sat completely separate from the professional one of the 4 people in Vivian's life she trusted without reservation, which was a small number arrived at through a long process of elimination. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he walked away without another word, moving through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of a man whose job required him to exist in rooms without being remembered. Vivian turned back toward the colonnade and waited. The waiting took 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which she measured by the music. Then the doors at the north end of the ballroom opened, and 6 Royal Guard soldiers walked in. Not the ceremonial guard that stood at the doors as decoration. These were operational soldiers in full tactical dress, hands on weapons not drawn, moving through the crowd with the efficient displacement of bodies that trained men produce when they enter a civilian space with a specific purpose. The crowd around them didn't panic. Panic required understanding, but it shifted, and the shifting rippled outward through the ballroom in a wave of confused attention, 500 heads turning to locate the disturbance, the orchestra stuttering on a note and then going quiet. The silence was complete in approximately 8 seconds, and into that silence, from the north entrance, came General Aldrich Voss. He was 60 years old, built like a man who had been constructed from harder materials than the usual ones, and he held a formal decree scroll in his left hand with the red wax seal of the imperial court pressed into it, still unbroken, which meant this was a public declaration rather than a private communication, which meant whatever it contained had been composed for an audience. He walked through the parted crowd toward the center of the ballroom, and then he stopped. And he looked directly at Vivian. The cold that moved through her body in that moment was not temperature. It was the specific cold of watching something you've anticipated arrive on schedule and discovering that anticipation had not actually prepared you for the arrival. She had known this was coming. She had known, and her hands still went rigid at her sides, her champagne glass held so carefully that the effort was visible in the tendons of her wrist. Vivian Ashcombe, Voss said, and his voice was built for rooms larger than ballrooms, trained for battlefields, and the name fell across the silence like something dropped from a height. Duchess of Blackthorn. She said nothing. She did not move. By order of the imperial court, he continued, the scroll still sealed in his hand, a theatrical choice, a choice designed to make the reading of it public and ceremonial and therefore permanent. You are hereby commanded to answer charges of conduct unbecoming a noble house of the empire. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman made a small sound, the kind of small sound that large rooms amplify. Specifically, Voss said, the charge of conducting an unlawful intimate liaison with an officer of the Royal Guard, in willful violation of your marital vows, in willful betrayal of House Blackthorn, and in violation of the Imperial Noble Conduct Code of 1842, Article 9, Sections 3 and 5. The crowd's silence transformed. It had been a shocked silence. Now it became something else. The silence of people who have been given information and are in the process of converting it into judgment, which is a faster process than it should be and always has been. Vivian's body made all its automatic adjustments. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted slightly. Her expression did not change. These were reflexes she had not consciously summoned. They had been trained into her since childhood. The physical vocabulary of a noblewoman encountering crisis in public, the grammar of visible dignity as armor. None of it touched what was happening inside her, which was the sensation of the floor of a very tall building giving way. Voss broke the seal, opened the scroll, read the formal charge in full, the elaborate legal language of the imperial court, the archaic phrasing that turned human catastrophe into procedure, every word of it carrying the weight of the empire's collective authority, bearing down on a single woman standing alone near a colonnade in a gown the color of winter water. She heard her name 37 times in the reading. She counted. When it was finished, the ballroom was still completely silent. Then Duke Cedric Blackthorn stepped forward from the crowd near the fireplace, and the crowd parted for him with the reflexive deference that power generates. And he walked toward his wife with his face composed into the expression of a man who is suffering enormously and managing that suffering with great dignity. It was an exquisitely performed expression. Vivian had seen him practice expressions in mirrors. She knew the relationship between the rehearsed version and the deployed version, and this one was deployed at approximately 90% effectiveness. He stopped 10 feet away from her. "Vivian," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and carried perfectly through the silence. "I want you to know that I take no satisfaction in this." She looked at him. She had a collection of things to say to him, a collection assembled over 4 months and 2 weeks, and now suddenly, urgently available, pressing against the inside of her teeth. She didn't say any of them. Not here. Not in front of 500 witnesses, in front of open scrolls, in front of soldiers with their hands on weapons. "No," she said instead. Just the word. Quiet and flat, and containing everything she was not going to say. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. She looked for guilt, and didn't find it. Something more interesting. A faint, quick satisfaction that he suppressed before it reached the surface of his expression. "The letters," said Voss, and a junior officer produced a leather document case and removed from it a bundle of correspondence tied with ribbon that had been deliberately creased, artificially aged, the ink just slightly too dark at the ends of lines where a careful forger would overwork their strokes. Vivian had never written those letters. She knew she had never written those letters with the same certainty she knew her own name, and looking at them from 10 feet away, she felt the knowledge land in her chest like a physical impact. Recovered from Captain Hale's private chambers 4 days ago. The handwriting has been verified by 3 independent experts employed by the imperial court. "I would like to see the letters," Vivian said. "You will have opportunity to review all evidence at your formal hearing," Voss said. "I would like to see them now." "That is not the process, Lady Blackthorne." Lady Blackthorne, not Duchess. The title reduction was not an accident. It was the first brick removed from the wall. The witness testimony, Voss continued, and now 3 individuals stepped forward from different positions in the crowd, which meant they'd been placed there, distributed strategically, so their emergence from different directions would read as spontaneous convergence rather than staged choreography. A lady's maid Vivian did not recognize. A footman from the Blackthorn townhouse in the capital. She recognized him. A young man named Davin, who had been hired 8 months ago and whom she had barely spoken to. And a noblewoman, Lady Hersworth, 45 years old, husband in the Emperor's Economic Council, a woman Vivian had considered a moderate ally for 6 years. Lady Hersworth would not meet her eyes. These 3 individuals have provided sworn testimony before the Imperial Court of Judge Magistrate Aldrin regarding direct personal observation of the accused and Captain Hale in circumstances consistent with the charges filed, Voss read from a secondary document. "What circumstances?" Vivian said. Not a question, a refusal to let the vague language stand. "Lady Blackthorne, what specific circumstances? What did they claim to observe? Where? When?" Her voice was still controlled, but something in it had shifted, not toward breaking, but toward hardness. "If you're going to do this in front of 500 people, General, do it completely." A flicker of something across Voss's face. Reluctance, possibly. Or respect, possibly. The two were difficult to distinguish in men who had made careers of following orders they personally found distasteful. He read the testimony summaries. Lady Hersworth had allegedly observed Vivian and Rowan in a private antechamber of the Eastern Palace wing during the autumn harvest reception, in what she described, in the clinical language of a court document, as a state of compromising physical proximity. The footman Davin had allegedly seen a letter delivered to Rowan from Vivian's personal writing paper with her private seal at the Blackthorn townhouse 6 weeks prior. The lady's maid, whose name Vivian did not recognize and whose face she had never seen, claimed to have discovered articles of the captain's personal property in the Duchess's private dressing room during a cleaning. 3 separate forms of evidence: letters, witnesses, physical objects. The triangulation of fabrication, constructed to be difficult to refute because refuting one leg of a triangle still leaves the other 2 standing. Cedric had been thorough. She would give him that. He had been absolutely, impeccably thorough. "I'd like to know," Vivian said in the same controlled, flat voice, "where Captain Hale is tonight." Another flicker in Voss's expression. "A tell. Captain Hale is being held pending investigation. He was here an hour ago." Lady Blackthorn, he was standing in this room 1 hour ago, General. He is a senior officer of the Royal Guard. What is the legal basis for detaining him without presenting him alongside me for this public reading? The question was good, and she knew it was good because it landed in the room differently than the previous ones. It had an edge that the previous questions had been approaching but not yet reaching, and the crowd shifted almost imperceptibly, the way crowds shift when a question opens a gap in something that had seemed solid. Voss did not have an answer that satisfied the question. He had a procedural answer, which he deployed: due process, separate investigations, appropriate legal framework, the choreography of official language closing around the gap she'd opened. And then Cedric said, "Vivian, please." And the softness in his voice, the constructed softness, the carefully deployed softness, the softness of a man performing wounded dignity, landed in the room exactly as it was designed to land, shifting sympathy back toward the wronged husband, sealing the gap. Vivian looked at him. "Please what, Cedric?" she said. He said nothing, just held the expression. 500 people watched the Duchess of Blackthorn face her husband in the grand ballroom of Veltherin Palace and say, "Please what into his performed sorrow," and the room split invisibly into the people who thought she was guilty, and the people who thought she was brave, and the people who would decide what they thought based entirely on which position turned out to be more socially advantageous. "Lady Blackthorn," Voss said, and now the soldiers behind him took a step forward in unison, "you are requested to accompany the Imperial Guard pending formal arraignment." There it was, the last sentence, the one she had been waiting for and dreading and calculating toward for 4 months and 2 weeks. She handed her champagne glass to no one. She simply released it, and a footman materialized from somewhere and caught it before it hit the floor. Palace staff training was immaculate, and she was briefly, absurdly grateful for this. And she turned to face the soldiers, and then she turned back. One last time, not toward Cedric. Past him, to the left, where Selina Vale was standing in her gold gown at the edge of the crowd near the fireplace, and where, in the shifting light of 500 candles and 3 enormous chandeliers, Vivian could see the expression on her face with perfect clarity. Selina was not performing sorrow. She was not performing anything. She was watching the scene unfold with the focused attention of someone watching the successful completion of a very long project, and on her face, transparent for one unguarded moment in the candlelight, was the unmistakable expression of a woman who has just gotten exactly what she wanted. She was standing close to Cedric's empty space. Her gold gown caught the firelight. She was already standing like a duchess. Vivienne filed that image away in the locked room inside herself, very precisely, very carefully. Then she walked toward the soldiers, and the crowd parted around her, and the silence in the grand ballroom of Veltherin Palace was the most complete silence she had ever heard. 500 people who had ceased, in this moment, to breathe. The soldiers formed around her. They did not touch her. Not yet, that came later, when the carriage door closed and the formalities dissolved into the mechanics of custody. But they surrounded her, a moving formation that told every person watching exactly what she was and was not anymore. She was almost through the north doors when she heard it. Behind her in the ballroom she was leaving, a single person began to applaud. Then another. Then a third. And within 10 seconds, not the room, not the whole room, the room was divided. The room contained people who would not clap for the wrong reasons and people who would not clap for the right ones. But a significant fraction of the room was clapping, and the sound of it followed her through the north doors and down the corridor, and continued until the marble walls swallowed it. She did not look back. She counted the seconds instead. This had become her primary tool for the management of the unmanageable, the reduction of catastrophe to countable units. She counted seconds in the north corridor, 43 of them, before the sound of the applause was completely gone. She counted the soldiers around her, 6. She counted the steps in the main staircase down to the palace's lower level, which she had walked dozens of times and knew to be 31, but counted again now, 31. She did not count the number of years she had given this house, this name, this man. That number was the one she could not make manageable. The carriage was waiting in the courtyard, not a public carriage, not a formal imperial transport, but something deliberately undistinguished, dark wood with no insignia, the specific anonymity of a vehicle designed to communicate that the person inside it no longer merited the ceremony of recognition. This was also intentional, also built. Everything tonight was built. They opened the carriage door and she got in and they closed it. And the sound of the latch was the sound of a door closing on 12 years, and the carriage began to move. And through the small, high window she could see the palace receding, a building she had walked through 1,000 times, in 1,000 different contexts, that was now behind her and behind a locked door she had not locked. And the distance between her and it was increasing at the pace of horses through a winter courtyard. She sat very still. She was not going to cry in this carriage. She was not going to do anything in this carriage except think, which was the only tool that remained available to her, which she would use with everything she had, which would have to be enough. What she knew, the charges were fabricated, the letters were forged, the witnesses were bought or coerced. The evidence was constructed by someone with access to court resources and the patience to build a case across multiple months. This pointed, without deviation, to her husband. What she did not know, whether anyone in the court structure above Cedric was aware of the fabrication or complicit in it, or whether the crown prince, who had the kind of relationship with accurate information that powerful men sometimes cultivated, had been told something true or something false. What she needed to know, where Rowan was, because Rowan's absence from the scene, the failure to produce him alongside her, the procedural language about separate investigations, Voss's tell when she'd asked the question, these were wrong. These were wrong in a specific way that sent a cold line of alarm through the center of her chest, sharper than the cold of the soldiers and the carriage and the receding palace. Captain Rowan Hale was a military officer with 12 years of impeccable record. If he had been detained as part of a legitimate investigation, he would have been detained formally, with documentation, with legal representation, within the structure of military law that protected officers of his rank. His absence tonight could be explained by that structure, but the tell on Voss's face when she'd asked where he was had not been the tell of a man navigating legitimate procedure. It had been the tell of a man who knew something he had been told not to say. The carriage hit a cobblestone, and the jolt moved through the wooden frame and through the bench she was sitting on and through her spine, and she pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed through it, and thought, Rowan, you walked away because I told you to walk away. And I told you to walk away because I thought that distance would protect you, and if they took you before I even left the room. She stopped that thought. She replaced it with something she could use. What she had, her mind. 12 years of watching Cedric build power and learning by proximity and close observation, how power was built and therefore how it could be dismantled. The locked room inside herself, which contained everything she had ever refused to say in the places where it mattered, everything she had catalogued, everything she had stored, every inconsistency and every lie and every moment she had filed away without yet knowing what she was filing it for. She realized now, been preparing for this specific moment for a long time without knowing she was preparing for it. She had been building something in that locked room. And Cedric, for all his thoroughness, for all his planning, for all the architecture of tonight's performance, had made one error. He had left her alive. He had left her with a mind that worked. He had engineered her destruction publicly, in front of witnesses, in front of the court record, which meant everything he had done was also on record, and records could be interrogated, and evidence could be examined, and the same court that had just named her faithless was the same court that would be obligated, if the evidence proved fabrication, to reverse that naming. He had used the Empire's machinery against her. She intended to use it back. The carriage was crossing the bridge over the Tel Var now, the underground prison's outer lights visible through the high window as a cold orange glow against the winter sky. She had perhaps 6 minutes before they arrived. She used the 6 minutes methodically, cataloging everything she could remember about the charges as stated, identifying the weaknesses in each evidence leg, constructing the beginning of a counter-architecture. She was so absorbed in this that she almost missed the sound, a sound from underneath the carriage. Not the road, not the wheels. Something else, a rhythmic wrong note in the mechanical language of the moving vehicle, subtle, almost inaudible beneath the horse hooves and the wheel noise and the wind. She went very still and listened. It came again. Tap, tap, tap. Then again, slightly different. Tap, tap, tap. A pattern, not accidental. Someone was underneath the moving carriage and had been there since the courtyard, and they were sending her a signal, and the signal was deliberate, and deliberate signals from unidentified people under arrest vehicles were either the best possible thing or the worst possible thing. And in her current position, the worst possible thing was such a wide category that she chose to treat it as the best one. She tapped back against the carriage floor with her heel. 2 taps. A pause. 1. The response came after 4 seconds, 3 taps in rapid succession, and then nothing. The carriage reached the outer gate of the underground prison and stopped for the guard check. And in the stopped stillness, the tap came one final time. Not a pattern this time, just a single sharp contact, like a punctuation mark, like something being underlined, like someone saying, "I am here. You are not alone." Remember that. The gate opened, the carriage moved forward into the prison courtyard, and the orange light closed over the high window, and the 6 soldiers opened the doors, and the mechanics of custody closed around Vivian Ashcombe as she stepped down from the carriage onto the stones of the Empire's deepest prison. She stepped down with her spine straight and her chin level and the locked room inside her full of things she was going to use, and she walked into the prison with the walk of a woman who has not yet begun to fight. She did not know yet that Rowan Hale had not been detained. She did not know yet that Rowan Hale had been given, 6 hours ago, a glass of wine in a private meeting room off the palace's east corridor, and that the wine had been treated with something that worked slowly and left no obvious mark, and that he was currently somewhere between the palace and a location that the man who had poured the wine had been very careful to make sure no one in the imperial court would ever find. She did not know yet that the single tap under the carriage, the last one, the punctuation mark, had not come from Rowan. She did not know who it had come from. She would spend the first 3 nights of her imprisonment in the dark, replaying those taps, turning them over in the locked room of her mind, understanding only that someone inside the palace's machinery had chosen, for reasons she could not yet identify, to let her know she was not completely alone. It was the smallest possible thing. It was the only thing she had. And somewhere above her, in the warmth and candlelight of the grand ballroom of Beltherin Palace, Duke Cedric Blackthorne accepted a glass of champagne from a footman and turned to Selina Vale with the expression of a man whose plan had worked, and touched his glass to hers, and did not think about his wife at all. 3 floors below the streets of the imperial capital, in the dark, Vivian Ashcombe sat on a stone bench in a cell that smelled of iron and winter and other people's despair, and she began, very quietly and very precisely, to plan. The stone bench was not designed for sitting. It had been designed for the specific purpose of ensuring that the person placed upon it would eventually choose the floor instead, which was the floor's way of winning. The slow, methodical victory of hard surfaces over human bodies that had not been built to endure them. Vivian had been sitting on the bench for what she estimated to be 4 hours, and she had not moved to the floor, and she intended not to move to the floor, because the floor was where they wanted her, and the bench was the first decision she still controlled. The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet. She had measured it by walking it, heel to toe, a technique she had learned from her father's estate surveyor when she was 9 years old, and had followed him around the northern fields asking questions he was too polite to not answer. 8 by 10. Stone on every surface, including the ceiling, which sweated moisture in thin lines that ran down the walls and pooled in the corners. 1 iron door with a viewing slot at eye level, currently closed. 1 small window near the ceiling, not large enough to admit a body, admitting instead a rectangle of winter black that told her it was still night, but told her nothing about which part of it. She had been listening to the prison since the door closed. This was the other thing her mind could do with catastrophe when calculation alone was insufficient. It could listen. The prison had a voice composed of many smaller voices, water moving through pipes somewhere in the walls, the specific acoustics of stone corridors, the distant, irregular pattern of other doors opening and closing, the footsteps of guards whose rotations she had already partially mapped by sound. She was building an architecture of the place from its audio signature, the way a blind person builds a room from the information available to them. It was something to do. More importantly, it was information. What she had not heard in 4 hours was any sound consistent with another prisoner being brought into the adjacent cells, which told her either the cells adjacent to hers were empty or they were occupied by people who had already learned to be completely silent, which told her something about how long those people had been here. She was thinking about the tap, the single sharp contact against the carriage floor in the prison courtyard, the punctuation mark, the period at the end of the message. She had replayed it enough times to be certain of what it was and uncertain of everything else about it. The pattern before it, 2 taps, pause, 1, then 3 rapid, was a response to her own response, which meant whoever was under the carriage had been waiting for her to respond before committing to anything further. That was caution. That was someone who had not wanted to reveal themselves until they knew she was paying attention. The question of who had the access, the information, and the motivation to put themselves under an imperial arrest carriage for the purpose of making contact with the woman inside it. That question narrowed the field considerably, and then, at the narrowest point, opened into several possibilities that she could not yet distinguish between. The door slot opened. She did not move, did not look toward it. This was a decision she'd made in the first hour, that whoever opened that slot would find her looking at the middle distance as though the slot's opening were a matter of mild, temporary interest at most. It was the posture of a woman who was still deciding how much of herself to give the room, which was a posture she had spent 12 years perfecting. "You're awake," said the voice behind the slot. Male, young, 25 maybe. Not a senior guard. The voice had the slightly thickened accent of someone from the river provinces, which meant he was probably not a local appointment, which meant he was probably not personally connected to any of the noble families whose maneuverings had put her here, which meant he was probably clean. "Yes," she said. "There's food." "What kind?" A pause. The question had surprised him. "Bread, some kind of soup." "Has it been in the cell before I arrived?" Another pause. Longer. "I don't... No. Kitchen just sent it." "Leave it outside the door. I'll take it when the slot closes." "You don't want me to bring it in?" "No." The slot closed. She heard the tray set down on the stone outside the door. She waited 40 seconds, then stood. The bench had won something from her spine, and the standing required more effort than she allowed to show on her face, though there was no one to see her face, and she moved to the door and opened the lower hatch and brought the tray in. Bread. Soup that was mostly water with something gray floating in it. A clay cup of water. She ate the bread and drank the water in the cup and left the soup because the smell of it was wrong in a way she couldn't specifically identify, which was sufficient reason. The River Province guard's footsteps moved away down the corridor. She sat back on the bench and thought about Rowan. Rowan Hale had grown up in the Orvith lowlands, the younger son of a military family that had produced 4 generations of imperial soldiers and was deeply, constitutionally suspicious of any institution it hadn't built itself. He had joined the Royal Guard at 19, which was 2 years younger than the standard age, on the strength of an entrance evaluation that the examining general had described in official documentation as the most complete physical and tactical assessment he'd seen in 30 years of reviewing candidates. He had been promoted to captain at 31, which was 6 years ahead of the normal trajectory. He was, in the operational vocabulary of the Guard, what the senior officers called a lifer, someone whose identity and the institution's identity had fused to the point where separation was essentially unimaginable. Which meant that if Cedric had wanted to neutralize him, had needed to neutralize him, because Rowan was the one person in the capital who had both the proximity to Vivian and the institutional power to make noise about fabricated evidence, Cedric had needed to do it cleanly, quietly, and in a way that didn't create a visible removal of a senior military officer that the Guard's own internal structure would ask questions about, which meant poison was more likely than assassination. Which meant Rowan was probably not dead. She held on to that probably. She was still holding it 2 hours later when the corridor outside her door became suddenly, completely louder, multiple sets of footsteps, faster than the Guard's rotation pace, and a voice she recognized with a physical reaction she had not authorized, the particular sharp authority of Lord Wren Ashby, the Duke of Cedric's counsel, a man she had last seen standing 40 feet away in the ballroom, watching her arraignment with an expression she had categorized even then, even in the chaos of those minutes, as something other than the satisfaction the rest of Cedric's circle was wearing, something more like discomfort. The slot opened. But it wasn't the River Province Guard this time. Ashby's face appeared in the slot. He was 53, narrow, with the kind of long face that conveyed severity without necessarily feeling it, and behind his eyes right now was the expression she'd catalogued in the ballroom, the discomfort that had graduated overnight into something more urgent. "Vivian," he said. "Lord Ashby." She didn't move from the bench. "This is an unusual hour for a social call." Stop. Not unkindly. I have 4 minutes before the rotation, and I need you to listen. I'm listening. Hale is gone. The word landed in the locked room, and she felt the room's contents shift. Define gone. He's not in the guard's detention. He's not in the capital. His second-in-command filed a location inquiry with the military secretary's office this morning and was told Hale had been transferred to a provincial post pending investigation, which is not standard protocol for an officer of his rank under an active charge, and which the military secretary delivered with the specific expression of a man who does not believe what he's saying. Cedric moved him. Someone moved him. The paperwork is signed, but the signature is... Ashby stopped, looked over his shoulder, looked back. The signature is Cedric's seal, but the handwriting on the authorization form isn't Cedric's. Someone in his circle signed it under his authority. Davin Holt, she said. Ashby's expression shifted. What makes you say that? The footman they used as a witness tonight was hired 8 months ago. No one hires footmen 8 months before they need a witness, unless they're building a case, which means Davin Holt is not a footman, or not only a footman. He's the operational manager of whatever structure Cedric built around this. He'd have access to the seal. Ashby was quiet for a moment, processing. Behind him down the corridor she could hear a door. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice dropped into the specific register of a man who has decided to cross a line and is doing it quickly before he can change his mind. "I don't know how deep this goes. I don't know if Voss is clean or not. What I know is that 3 members of the Imperial Legal Council were given the case file last night, and 2 of them signed the arraignment without reviewing the evidence package, which is irregular. And the third one, Magistrate Corin, refused to sign and was removed from the case this morning on grounds of conflict of interest, which is fabricated," she said. "Which is fabricated, yes." He glanced back again. "I can't be seen here longer. I came to tell you that Corin is still alive, still practicing, and still angry. That's what I can give you." "It's something," she said. "It's the only thing I have." He looked at her through the slot. Really looked. The way people rarely look at someone in a cell, as though the cell were a membrane that made looking more honest somehow. "I voted for the alliance with your family 17 years ago," he said, when Cedric proposed the match. "I was the one who argued for it in council." A pause. "I want you to know that." The slot closed. She sat with the information for a long time after his footsteps faded, not processing it emotionally. Emotion was a resource she was rationing with great care, the way you ration water when you don't know how long the journey is, but structurally. Corinne was a thread, a loose end in the fabricated tapestry, a magistrate who had refused to sign and been removed rather than persuaded, which meant Corin had something, some specific knowledge or specific principle that made him refuse, and that something was potentially useful. Getting to Corin from inside an underground cell was a problem she could not yet solve, but the fact that Ashby had come at all, had risked the rotation, had crossed into her cell's corridor during what was almost certainly an unscheduled visit that he'd had to engineer some pretext for, told her something about the court's internal temperature. Cedric's operation had been clean enough to execute the arrest and the arraignment. It had not been clean enough to produce unanimous conviction in the people who watched it happen. There were people in that room last night who were doing what Vivian had spent 12 years learning to do, filing inconsistencies into locked rooms for future examination. She was not completely alone. She repeated this to herself without comfort, because comfort was not the point. The point was tactical accuracy. The days organized themselves into a rhythm that the prison imposed and she declined to fully accept. Meals at intervals she measured by hunger rather than clock. Guard rotation she had fully mapped by the end of the second day. The River Province guard, whose name, she learned on the third day, was Pell. Young, provincial, possessed of the particular integrity of someone who has not yet been in proximity to enough power to understand how power corrupts people like him. Though it would, eventually, it always did. He left extra water without being asked. This was either compassion or the beginning of an information relationship, and she treated it as both simultaneously, because the two categories were not mutually exclusive and only a fool pretended they were. She thought about this, about the line between genuine human decency and instrumentalized human decency, during the long hours when thinking was the only occupation available. She had been raised with a definition of integrity that kept those two categories separate. You were decent to people because they were people, not because they might be useful. She still believed this in the abstract. In the specific, in the stone cell, in the context of everything that had been done to her with the full cooperation of multiple people who had calculated exactly how useful her destruction would be to their various projects, she found herself revising the abstract into something more complex. Something that had to do with the difference between using people and seeing people clearly. You could see someone clearly, see every angle of their usefulness, and still treat them as a person. The seeing didn't have to corrupt the treating. Cedric had never learned this. It was possibly the foundational error of his character. The belief that seeing people's utility and seeing people's humanity were competing activities, that you had to choose one or the other, that choosing humanity was a form of strategic blindness. He had chosen utility with such completeness that he had eventually been unable to see even his closest relationships as anything other than leverage matrices. She wondered sometimes in the small, cold hours if he had ever seen her as anything else. She thought the answer was yes, once, very early, before the weight of the dukedom and the weight of ambition and the weight of whatever had happened to Cedric Blackthorne between 30 and 41 had reorganized his interior landscape into what it currently was. She thought there had been 18 months, maybe 24, early in the marriage, when he had looked at her the way the people who loved her looked at her, directly, without calculating the angle. Then something had shifted and the calculating had begun, and she had watched it begin and had told herself it was the pressure of the title, the demands of the court, the normal evolution of a man in a position of significant power. She had been, she understood now, absolutely wrong about that. The calculating had always been there. The early period had been the performance of its absence, which meant she had spent 12 years married to a performance. The thought arrived without the devastation she might have expected. The devastation had happened in real time, over months, in small doses. Each inconsistency filed away had been its own small grief, processed in private, stored. What remained now was not grief, but a kind of clear-eyed fury that she kept very controlled, very precise, like a flame turned down to its lowest possible setting to conserve fuel. On the morning of the 4th day, the slot opened, and it was not Pell. It was a woman, 40 years old perhaps, dark hair with a streak of gray she had not bothered to cover, which told Vivian immediately that this was someone who had reached the age where not covering the gray was a statement rather than an oversight. Sharp face. Eyes that moved across Vivian with the professional assessment of a physician doing triage. Quick, thorough, unglamorous. "I have 15 minutes, the woman said. No introduction, no title. "My name is Sarah Morn. I'm Magistrate Corin's clerk." Vivian did not move from the bench. "Corin sent you. Corin doesn't know I'm here." Morn's voice was flat and efficient, the voice of someone who had decided to do something she wasn't certain about and had decided the uncertainty was not relevant. "I came because I have access to the evidence package filed with the court, and I've read it 3 times, and it has a problem." "Tell me the problem." "The letters." Morn looked over her shoulder and then back, the quick check of someone who was not used to operating this way and was managing the unfamiliarity. "The letters are dated across 7 months, beginning 14 months ago. The paper is consistent with your household supply. Same watermark, same weight. But the ink..." She paused. 3 of the letters use an ink compound that hasn't been available from the capital's primary suppliers for the last 19 months. It was discontinued when the supplier's main import contract with the eastern provinces collapsed. Vivian looked at her. Someone used old ink. Someone used old ink on new letters and dated them to a period when that ink was already unavailable. Which means either your household stockpiled 19 months of discontinued ink for exclusive personal use, or the letters were forged by someone who sourced old ink to match a specific timeline and made a calculation error about availability dates. Yes. Morn's expression was the expression of someone who has been sitting with a specific piece of information and has not known what to do with it and has finally decided to do the only thing available. "I need you to understand that if this goes anywhere, if I take this anywhere, I lose my position. Corin loses what protection he currently has. And whoever has the ear of the 2 magistrates who signed without reviewing the evidence package will move to close this gap as soon as it becomes visible." "I understand." Vivian said. "What do you want from me?" "I want to know if there are other gaps. Things you know that aren't in the evidence package. Things that can be triangulated against what I've found." The question was the right question, and it arrived at the right time. She had been constructing a list of exactly these things since the night of the arraignment, running the evidence as stated against everything she actually knew, locating the places where the fabrication intersected with reality in ways that couldn't be fully reconciled. She had a list. She had been waiting for someone with access to the evidence package to bring her a piece she could use to anchor it. The ink was an anchor. She told Morn about the footman Davin Holt, and the hire date, and the structural argument for his role. She told her about Lady Hersworth's specific social position and the economic council connection through her husband, which gave Hersworth a motive that had nothing to do with genuine witness testimony and everything to do with self-preservation within a power structure Cedric had been quietly reorganizing for 2 years. She told her about the timeline, 14 months of letters, beginning exactly at the moment Vivian had noticed the first shift in Cedric's behavior, which was either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that whoever built the fabrication had been watching her closely enough to use her own life as source material. Morn listened without interrupting. She was memorizing rather than taking notes, which was the correct choice for a woman conducting an unauthorized prison visit, and the fact that she'd made it without being told Vivian something about her. "One more thing," Vivian said. "The third witness, the lady's maid I don't recognize. Petra Voss. Relation to General Voss? Relation to..." Morn's expression answered the question before she did. "His niece, 22. No prior court employment record." The silence between them had the specific weight of a piece fitting into a frame. Voss's niece as the third witness, which meant Voss's tell, the tell she'd read when she asked about Rowan's location, was not the tell of a man navigating legitimate procedure. It was the tell of a man who was inside the structure and knew exactly how far inside he was. "He's not clean," Vivian said. "No." Morn looked at her steadily. "Which means this goes further up than Cedric alone." "How far up?" "I don't know yet." The sentence landed in the locked room and reorganized everything inside it. She had been operating on the assumption that Cedric was the architect and everyone around him was either recruited or deceived. The possibility that the architecture had a ceiling higher than Cedric, that this was not simply a nobleman eliminating an inconvenient wife, but something with a larger structural purpose. That possibility changed the geometry of everything. "Find the authorization for Hale's transfer," she said. "The actual document, not the copy in the military secretary's record. The original, wherever it originated. If the signature is forged, the forgery will be specific to someone with access to Cedric's seal, and access to that seal is logged in the household record, and household records are..." "Filed with the Imperial Administrative Archive," Morn said. "Yes, I can get there." "How much time do you need?" "A week. Maybe less." She looked at Vivian one final time. The look of someone cataloging what they see because they don't know if they'll see it again and want the record to be accurate. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone more..." She stopped, chose a different word. "More broken." Vivian looked at her. "The week isn't over yet." Morn almost smiled. It was the fastest almost smile Vivian had ever seen, there and gone before it fully formed. The expression of someone who had learned to keep the soft parts internal. Then she was gone, footsteps retreating down the corridor, and the slot closed, and Vivian was alone again with the stone and the seeping walls and the rectangle of winter sky and the high window. She thought about what Morn had said, more broken. She thought about what it meant that she wasn't visibly, which was a different thing but also an important thing. And she thought about how the line between resilience and suppression was thinner than the people who celebrated resilience usually acknowledged. She was functioning. She was thinking clearly and cataloging information and building strategy and declining to cry in the carriage or on the bench or anywhere else she could be observed. None of this was the same as being whole. The damage was there. She could feel its outline the way you feel a bruise when you press against it. The thing was present, had weight, was real. She had simply learned over 12 years to press against bruises without making the sound you made when something hurt. This was not strength, it was a skill. She was not sure anymore that the distinction mattered. On the sixth day, the newspaper arrived. Pell slid it through the lower hatch with his eyes forward and his face carefully neutral in the way of a man doing a thing he has been told not to do and has decided to do anyway on grounds he would not be able to articulate if asked. She picked it up from the floor. The front page of the Imperial Courier, center column, below the fold. A woodcut illustration of a woman in chains rendered with the specific artistic cruelty of caricature. Exaggerated features, degraded posture, the artist's interpretation of guilt, expressed through physical distortion. The faithless duchess. Blackthorn. Scandal deepens as evidence reviewed. She read it in full. Twice. The first read for content, the second for structure. For what the article chose to include and exclude. For the sourcing of each claim. For the language used to characterize the evidence versus the language used to characterize her character. For any hint in the framing of editorial direction that would tell her which way the newspaper's ownership was leaning. The article was precise. It included the charges in full. It included summary testimony from Lady Hersworth, but quoted directly, which meant Hersworth had been made available to the press, which meant someone was managing the public narrative with the same deliberateness they'd managed the arraignment. It included a statement from a palace spokesperson confirming that Duke Blackthorn, in this difficult time, appreciated the court's expeditious handling of the case and looked forward to the restoration of his house's honor. It included no statement from Vivienne, not because she hadn't been asked. She hadn't been asked. That was, in itself, a choice someone had made. It included in the fourth paragraph a single sentence about Cedric's upcoming social schedule, an announcement that the Duke of Blackthorn would be attending the spring convocation in 3 weeks alongside Lady Selina Vale, confirmed as his personal guest, in what the article characterized as the Duke's effort to maintain his public obligations during a period of personal difficulty. 3 weeks. The spring convocation. The formal gathering of the empire's 30 highest noble houses, with the emperor presiding. The most visible social event of the year, the one where alliances were cemented and relationships formalized, and the court's collective understanding of the power hierarchy was refreshed and updated. The event where, if you appeared with someone on your arm, the appearance meant something that every single person in the room understood without being told. 3 weeks was not enough time to build a case, find Rowan, locate Corrin's protection, and construct a counter-architecture from a stone cell 8 feet by 10 feet. She knew this, and the knowledge was the thing she pressed against now, the bruise with the sharpest outline, the calculation she had been running since Morn left, and which kept returning the same answer. The timeline was not survivable at its current pace. If Cedric appeared at the spring convocation with Selina Vale as his formal companion, the court's collective understanding of the situation would calcify around that image, and the calcification would be almost impossible to reverse. Public narrative, once set in imperial stone, required twice the force to chip than it had taken to set. She needed to change the timeline. She needed to move faster than the resources she had available could move, which meant she needed different resources, and the resource she did not have and needed most was access. Access to the court, to the archive, to the magistrate's record, to Rowan's location, to everything that existed outside 8 feet by 10 feet of stone. And the only access she had, the only conduit between her cell and everything outside it, was a River Province guard named Pell, who had slid her a newspaper and was standing in the corridor right now trying to look like he hadn't. She made a decision. The decision was the kind she had spent 12 years avoiding, the kind that required her to cross a line between seeing someone's utility and using it, the line she had told herself she would never fully cross, because the crossing was what Cedric did, and she was not Cedric. She crossed it. She crossed it with her eyes open, and with the full awareness of what the crossing meant. And she told herself that the difference between her and Cedric was not that she would never use what was available to her, but that she would never pretend she wasn't doing it. The honesty was not absolution, but it was something. Pell, she said. A beat. Then his voice, close to the door. Ma'am, I need a letter delivered. Silence. She could hear him thinking, the quality of silence produced by a young man weighing risk against the thing in him that had slid her the newspaper in the first place. That's against... I know what it's against, she said. I'm asking anyway. You can say no. A long pause. 12 seconds. 15. Then, who to? Magistrate Corin. The letter contains no names. It contains a date, a compound name, and 3 words. Nothing that connects to you. She waited. It will take you 30 seconds to deliver it to the magistrate's public submission box, which is accessible to any citizen of the Empire and which does not require you to identify yourself. Another pause, shorter this time. The decision had already been made. He was just reaching the end of the process of making it. You have paper? I need paper. He slid a folded sheet through the lower hatch without saying anything else. She tore it to a quarter size and wrote on it with the stub of charcoal she had been conserving since finding it in the corner of the cell on the 2nd day. Conservation being another thing the dark taught you, the instinctive hoarding of every small resource against an uncertain future. She wrote, ink compound discontinued 19 months prior, authorization original. 3 weeks is all it takes to bury a body or move one. She folded it, slid it back under the door. Pell's footsteps moved away. She sat back on the bench and looked at the high window, where the winter sky was beginning its early shift from black to the very dark gray that preceded dawn. She had not slept. She had not slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch in 6 days, and she was aware of what this was doing to the precision of her thinking. The edges of things were slightly less sharp than they had been, the connections between pieces of information arriving a half-second slower than she wanted them to. She could not afford to degrade further. She needed to sleep. She lay down on the bench, which was not designed for lying down, and closed her eyes. She thought about the tap under the carriage, the single sharp contact that had said, "I am here," in the language of percussion against wood. She had been living with this unknown for 6 days, and it had settled into the category of things she was managing through containment. Not resolved, not forgotten, but held at a specific distance where it couldn't destabilize what needed to be stable. She thought, if whoever tapped that carriage is outside this building, they have 6 days of information I don't have. 6 days of watching what Cedric does with the pieces now that the first move has been made. 6 days of watching who moves where and who talks to whom and what the court's temperature is running. She thought, they chose to contact me in the carriage, which means they wanted me to know about them before I arrived here. Which means they anticipated that I would be here long enough for the knowledge to matter, which meant they had a longer timeline than she currently had. The dawn gray in the window deepened by a shade. She was almost asleep when she heard it. Not from beneath the floor, not from the door. From the wall. The east wall. The one she had catalogued as an exterior wall based on the temperature differential between it and the others, the one that faced whatever was outside the prison's eastern boundary. A sound, very small, the sound of something being worked against stone, patient, methodical, the sound of a tool finding the gap between 2 blocks and pressing into it in slow repetition. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. She pressed her palm flat against the east wall and stood very still and felt it. The faintest possible vibration, barely a vibration at all, more the memory of vibration than the thing itself. Someone was on the other side of this wall. Someone with a tool and patience and enough knowledge of the prison's architecture to know that this specific wall was the thinnest, or the oldest, or the least monitored. Someone who had mapped this building from outside the way she had mapped it from inside. The working stopped. She pressed harder against the stone as though pressure could pull information through rock. Then, impossibly, she felt it. A small piece of the mortar between 2 blocks, lower down, near the floor, crumbling inward under her palm. A piece no larger than her thumbnail, falling away from the wall into the cell, leaving a gap the width of a finger joint, and through that gap came the thinnest thread of cold, outside air, and something else. She dropped to her knees and pressed her eye to the gap. Dark. Stone. Then the movement of a figure, poorly lit, pressed close against the exterior wall of the prison, and a face turning toward the crack, finding it. And in the minimal light, she could see enough of the features to understand that this was not a stranger. She had never met this person, but she recognized the description. The close-cut hair, the way the figure held itself with the particular physical economy of someone trained to use space efficiently. The insignia on the collar that was not the royal guards and was not any noble houses, and was something she had seen exactly once before on a document in Cedric's private study, A document she had photographed in memory precisely because it was the one document in that study that she couldn't immediately identify. The insignia of the Crown Prince's private investigative office. The figure's mouth moved close to the gap, and a voice came through. Barely a voice, more a shaped breath, a whisper compressed to its essential information. Vivian Ashcombe, Adrian Evermont sends word. The ink compound has a supplier record. We have it. She pressed her mouth to the gap. Hale. Where is Hale? A pause. The figure's eyes moved, checking, rechecking, then back to the gap. Alive, protected, not here. How long? Until the evidence is enough, he says. Another check. He says to tell you he's still in the room. He never left the room. He never left the room. A message constructed to be unintelligible to anyone but her, because no one else knew about the conversation at the South Colonnade. No one else knew about the specific language of that specific exchange. I'm still in the room. The room meaning the situation, the fight, the thing she was in. Rowan was alive. The Crown Prince was watching. The evidence existed. And the carriage tap, the contact she had been carrying as an unknown for 6 days, made sense now with the cold, clean clarity of a final piece dropping into place. Not the Crown Prince's investigator under the carriage. Someone else. Someone who had been in position earlier, who had known before the investigators did, who had timed the contact for the exact moment of maximum psychological impact. The arrival at the prison, the closing door, because they understood that the woman inside that carriage needed, at that specific moment, to know she was not alone. Who tapped the carriage? She said. The compressed whisper carried an urgency she did not bother to remove. The figure outside the wall was still for a moment. Then, someone who's been inside the house for 2 years. She understood. She understood with the force of something that had been approaching from a long distance and had just arrived. 2 years. Someone inside the Blackthorn household for 2 years, which was the same time frame as Davin Holt's appearance, which was not a coincidence, which meant the architecture Cedric had built for her destruction had been built alongside an architecture she had not known about, a counterstructure, running parallel in the dark, assembled by someone working for the Crown Prince from inside the enemy's own construction. Cedric had built a trap, and while he built it, someone else had been building the door out of it. When? She said. The convocation, the figure said. 3 weeks is exactly enough. The mortar crumbled slightly more as the figure shifted back, pressing something into the gap from outside. Small, flat, cold metal. She took it. A disc the size of a thumbnail, brass, embossed with a falcon in flight, wings fully extended, head turned toward the horizon. The Crown Prince's personal seal. She closed her hand around it. 3 weeks, she said. The figure had already gone. She remained on her knees on the stone floor for a long moment, her fist closed around the brass disc, the thread of cold outside air coming through the gap in the mortar against her face. The cell was the same 8 by 10 feet it had been for 6 days. The bench was the same stone. The walls ran the same seeping moisture. The window above her held the same rectangle of early winter sky, which had gone now from dark gray to the pale, colorless gray of approaching dawn. The specific gray that existed before the sun committed to anything. She stood. She went to the bench and sat on it the way she had been sitting on it for 6 days. Spine straight, chin level, hands flat on her thighs. But something had changed in the cell since she'd sat down the first time, and the thing that had changed was not the room. The room was identical. What had changed was the information she was sitting inside, and information she had discovered across 12 years of living with a man who weaponized it, was the only thing that actually altered the geometry of a space. Not the walls, not the stone. The walls were whatever they were. The stone was whatever age of cold patience had made it. What changed rooms was what you knew inside them. She now knew the Crown Prince was moving. Rowan was alive. The evidence had gaps that the right people were beginning to see and document. Someone inside Cedric's own structure had been working against him for 2 years, and had chosen her, specifically at the moment of maximum isolation, to receive the first signal. 3 weeks. She thought about the spring convocation, about Cedric walking into that room with Selena Vale on his arm, and the court's 200 most powerful people watching. About the image they would compose together. The wrong duke, the beautiful companion, the tidy narrative of a man moving forward after betrayal. She thought about what it would look like when that image shattered, not shattered privately, not in a council chamber or a magistrate's office, in the same room, in front of the same people, with the same 500 witnesses who had watched her dragged out of the ballroom in the organized theater of Cedric's plan, the same stage, the same audience, a different ending. Her hand was still closed around the brass disc. She could feel the falcon's wings against her palm, the raised edge of the embossing, the cool, specific weight of a very old institution reaching through a prison wall to put something in her hand. She thought, he made one mistake. He left the stage standing. Outside, the sky completed its transition from gray to something almost white, and the first light of morning entered the cell through the high window and landed on the stone floor, and was the first sunlight she had seen in 6 days, and she looked at it without moving from the bench, without extending her hand toward it, without performing the symbolic meaning of light falling in a dark place. She just noted it precisely, as information. The light was there. Morning had arrived. And in 3 weeks, she was going to walk back into the grand ballroom of Veltherin Palace, not in chains, not in the custody of soldiers, not as the subject of a performance someone else had written. She was going to walk in as herself. She had no idea yet what that would cost. She knew it would cost something enormous, that the 3 weeks between now and the convocation were going to require her to cross more lines than the one she had crossed with Pell, and to cross them with the full knowledge of what crossing cost, and to carry the cost without letting it change her into something she did not recognize. She was going to have to become, in 3 weeks, something she had never been required to be before. The woman who had spent 12 years learning the architecture of power from the inside of it, and using every single thing she had learned. The morning light moved across the floor. She opened her hand and looked at the falcon, wings extended, head turned toward the horizon. Then she closed her fist around it again and began. The brass falcon sat on the stone floor in front of her for the first 3 days after the wall contact, positioned precisely where the morning light reached it. Not for sentiment, not for symbolism, but because the light moved across it at a predictable angle and the movement served as a clock. She had been rationing her thinking into intervals, and the falcon marked them. Dawn to the point where the light hit the falcon's wing, first interval. Wing to head, second. Head to disappearance as the sun climbed past the window's angle, third. 3 intervals per morning, 5 minutes each approximately. 15 minutes of structured calculation before the light left, and she moved to the longer, less disciplined work of the day. The brass was warm from her hand by the 3rd morning. She noticed this and categorized it and did not attach anything to it. Morn had not come back. This was the primary variable she could not account for. She had sent the letter through Pell on day 6, the letter that contained the compressed message about the ink compound, the authorization original, the 3 weeks, and Morn had been the one who brought the ink information in the first place, which meant Morn was already moving in the right direction. What Vivian needed from her was the authorization document, the original paper that had transferred Rowan out of the capital with a forged signature, which, if located in the Imperial Administrative Archive, would give Corin the predicate for demanding a full evidence review. Morn not returning could mean several things. It could mean she was finding the document and needed time. It could mean she'd been identified and stopped. It could mean she had assessed the risk and made the rational decision that crossing an operation that reached to General Voss's level was a risk she had not signed up for when she'd taken a clerk's position in a magistrate's office. Vivian ran the probabilities and arrived at nothing conclusive, which was the result she'd been arriving at every time she ran them, and which she was getting somewhat better at tolerating. Pell slid food through the hatch each morning and said nothing, and she said nothing back, which was a different kind of communication than the kind that used words. The specific language of 2 people who had exchanged something significant and were managing the weight of that exchange by pretending, in the daily light, that it hadn't happened. On the morning of day 11, the door opened. Not the slot, the door. She was on her feet before it had swung halfway, which was the physical reflex of 11 days of close-quarters alertness, the body's own surveillance system operating faster than conscious thought. 2 guards she did not recognize, and behind them, filling the frame in the particular way that large men who know they're large use doorways, Lord Councillor Edmund Brast. Brast was 67, which sat on him like a second, heavier coat. He moved under the weight of his own authority the way very old, powerful men sometimes did, as though decades of deference had given the authority physical mass. He had been on the Imperial Privy Council for 22 years. He was the third highest-ranking civilian official in the empire. He had dark eyes that had not softened with age, which was rare. Most people's eyes softened. His had only gotten more specific. He looked around the cell with the expression of a man cataloging an environment he finds distasteful but will not say so. "Sit down, Lady Ashcombe," he said. "I'll stand." A pause. He looked at her. She looked at him. The guards in the doorway were doing the thing guards did when their presence was ceremonial. Present, but not attending, eyes forward, processing nothing. "As you like," Brast said. He did not sit either, which meant they were going to have this conversation on their feet in an 8x10 cell, which was a kind of intimacy that she doubted he had intended, and that she intended to use. "You're here without announcement," she said, "which means this isn't a formal visit." "No." "Then you're here on your own authorization." "I'm here because certain developments over the past 11 days have made a conversation necessary." He clasped his hands behind his back. It was a deliberate gesture, the body language of a man who wants to communicate that he is not a threat, which was itself a form of threat. "You've been active." "I've been sitting in a cell." "You've been sitting in a cell sending messages through a guard with River Province vowels and receiving visitors through gaps in your eastern wall." He watched her face. "We know about the Falcon." The cold that moved through her was not temperature and not fear. It was the specific sensation of a calculation being revised while you were still in the middle of it. The floor shifting, the architecture of what you knew reorganizing itself around a new piece of information that changed the structure's load-bearing walls. She did not look at the floor where the Falcon sat. She looked at Brast. "Then you know the Crown Prince is involved," she said. Flat, controlled. "I know someone using the Crown Prince's seal made contact with you. Whether the Crown Prince himself authorized that contact..." Brast paused, and the pause was doing something she didn't like. A weight in it that was not the weight of a man being careful with legal language. Is a question that is currently more complicated than it was 11 days ago. "Explain complicated." He looked at her for a moment with the eyes that had not softened. Then he moved to the bench and sat on it, which was the gesture of a man who had decided the conversation was going to be long enough to require accommodation and who did not care that sitting while she stood gave her the physical advantage. "Prince Adrian Evermont," he said, "is 28 years old and has been conducting an unofficial investigative operation through his private office for the past 14 months. This operation has, to date, produced documentation on 7 instances of noble house corruption involving evidence fabrication, witness coercion, and in 2 cases, falsified death records." He looked at his hands. "It is a thorough operation. It is also an unauthorized operation, conducted without the Emperor's knowledge or approval, funded through channels that do not appear in the imperial budget." She said nothing. The picture was assembling itself, and she was letting it assemble rather than asking questions that would slow the assembly. "The Emperor," Brast continued, "became aware of this operation 8 days ago. Not through the prince, through a member of the prince's private staff who made the decision, on grounds I will not characterize, to bring the information to the palace's senior council." She heard it before he finished the sentence. 8 days ago. The contact through the wall had been 11 days ago, and the figure had told her the Crown Prince's office had the supplier record for the ink compound. 8 days ago, someone in the prince's private staff had gone to the senior council, 3 days after the wall contact. "The staff member," she said, "will not be named in this conversation." "Was it the person who contacted me through the wall?" Brast's face answered the question. Not with movement, he was too controlled for movement, but with the stillness that replaced movement when a question landed accurately, the stillness of a man who has just confirmed something he did not intend to confirm. The figure through the wall. The person who had pressed the falcon into her hand. Who had told her the prince was moving, that Rowan was protected, that 3 weeks was exactly enough. Went to the senior council 3 days later. The implications were too large to look at directly and too important to look away from, so she did what she did with every piece of information this size. She filed it precisely and kept her face exactly as it had been. "What does the Emperor want?" she said. Brast looked at her with what might have been, on a different face, something like reluctant respect. The Emperor wants the situation resolved with minimum damage to the imperial court's structural integrity. The charges against you are... He stopped. Chose a different word than whatever he'd been going to say. The charges are under review. Under review. Magistrate Corin has filed a formal evidence challenge on the basis of material inconsistency in the documentary evidence. The ink, among other things. What other things? Lady Ashcombe, Lord Brast. She kept her voice at exactly the same register he was using. Conversational, neither hard nor soft. The register of two people who understand each other's position and are not pretending otherwise. You are in my cell at dawn without announcement because the situation has moved past the point where the standard management of it is sufficient. If you want this conversation to be useful to whatever outcome the Emperor is looking for, tell me what Corin found. Brast was quiet for 6 seconds, long enough to be a decision rather than a pause. The authorization for Captain Hale's transfer, he said, the original document. Morn located it in the Imperial Administrative Archive 4 days ago. The signature is Cedric Blackthorne's seal applied correctly. The handwriting is not Cedric Blackthorne's. It has been compared against the handwriting of 3 individuals with documented access to the ducal seal, and the comparison yields a match to... He stopped again. To someone whose identity creates a complication. She waited. Devin Holt, he said, is not a footman. I know. He is a licensed agent of the Imperial Intelligence Directorate, has been for 6 years. He was placed in the Blackthorne household on standard domestic surveillance protocol. The Directorate maintains agents in 12 of the 30 highest noble houses as a matter of routine monitoring. She understood the complication. Davin Holt was not Cedric's operative. Or not only Cedric's operative, he was an Imperial intelligence asset who had been running inside the Blackthorne household for 6 years, and the authorization for Rowan's transfer had been signed in his handwriting, which meant either Holt had been turned by Cedric and had used his Imperial position to extend the operation's reach, or the Directorate itself had a reason to want Rowan removed, or the complications went somewhere that she was not yet seeing. How does this complicate the evidence challenge? She said, and she heard her own voice and noted its flatness, and knew the flatness was doing work that emotion would undo. An Imperial intelligence agent's testimony and documentation exist in a legal category that is not fully subject to standard court evidentiary review, Brast said. If Holt's role becomes part of the formal record, the Directorate has standing to file a jurisdictional claim over the relevant documentation, which would remove it from Corin's review, which would close the gap in the evidence. She looked at him steadily. Someone in the Directorate knows this. Yes. Someone in the Directorate is currently filing or preparing to file the jurisdictional claim. The claim was filed yesterday morning. Yesterday morning. 4 days after Morn found the document. 3 days after the Emperor became aware of the prince's operation. 1 day before Brast was sitting on her bench at dawn. She thought about this timeline with the specific kind of thinking that happened when the architecture you'd been building suddenly revealed a different blueprint underneath. When the thing you thought you were looking at turned out to be the surface of something else entirely, something older and deeper and more structurally significant. She thought, Cedric did not build this alone. She thought, he may not have built it at all. The Directorate director, she said. Who is it? That is not Brast. She heard the edge in her own voice and did not pull it back. I have been in this cell for 11 days on fabricated charges. The forgery trail leads not to my husband's personal operation, but to an Imperial intelligence asset. If you want the Emperor's resolution to have any integrity, the question of who authorized Holt's actions is not a secondary question. It is the question. Brast looked at the floor for a moment, then up. Director Aldrich Voss, he said. She went very still. Not Voss as a participant, Voss as the director. The man who had stood in the grand ballroom and read her charges from a formal decree scroll. The man whose tell she had read when she asked about Rowan, not the tell of a man navigating legitimate procedure, but the tell of a man who knew exactly what had happened and had been told not to say it. Not because he was complicit in Cedric's plan, because it was his plan. The brass falcon was on the floor 3 feet away and she did not look at it. She ran the new architecture in her head at speed, laying the pieces she had over the foundation she had just been given. Voss as Director of Imperial Intelligence, with a niece planted as a witness and an agent planted in the household for 6 years. not serving Cedric's agenda but running it, using Cedric as the visible mechanism of an operation that was actually structured above Cedric's level and for a purpose that was actually structural rather than personal. Cedric had wanted to replace her. That was real, and that was true, and the personal cruelty of it was not diminished by this new information. But the machinery he had used, the scale of it, the access, the resources, had never been within Cedric's individual capacity to build. He had not built it. He had been given it. He had been given an operation designed by someone else, for reasons that served the Empire's intelligence architecture more than they served one duke's desire to install a younger mistress. "Why?" she said. One word. Brass looked at her with the eyes that had not softened. "Your father's northern estate." She heard the words, and the words landed, and she held very still while the picture completed itself with the clean, terrible clarity of a painting's final brushstroke. Her father's northern estate. The Ashcombe holdings in the Vithara territories, 600 square miles of land that abutted the Empire's northern military corridor, that controlled access to the 3 primary mountain passes used by imperial supply lines, that had been governed by her family for 4 generations under a hereditary title that was, by the terms of the original land grant, non-transferable except through direct family succession. Non-transferable except under certain specific provisions of the Noble Corruption Code. Article 12, Section 8, which provided that estates held by families whose members had been convicted of crimes against the nobility could be subject to imperial absorption. "If I'm convicted," she said, and her voice was completely flat now, beyond flat, at some register that was below controlled and above broken, in the specific space that opened between the two, when a person understood that what has been done to them was not personal and was therefore, somehow, worse. "If I'm convicted of adultery under the Noble Conduct Code, my family name carries the conviction, and under Article 12, Section 8, Brass said quietly. "Yes. The Vithara Passes, the northern military corridor, the Empire's primary supply route to its 3 northern forts, which had been a point of strategic concern in the intelligence community for a decade because the Ashcombe family's independent governance of that corridor represented the one section of the northern route not under direct imperial control. Cedric had not destroyed her for love. He had not destroyed her for Selena Vale. He had been handed an operation that served the intelligence community's decade-long interest in the Vithara holdings, and he had been offered, in exchange for his cooperation, the precise things he wanted: the clean removal of an inconvenient wife, the social freedom to install Selena Vale, the appearance of a wronged man that the court's sympathies would support. He had been offered what he wanted. And what Voss had wanted, underneath the performance of it, was her family's land. She had been used as the mechanism for a territorial acquisition. The thing inside her, the controlled flame, rationed and banked and carefully managed for 11 days, flared once, hard, with a heat she felt in her hands and her jaw and behind her eyes. She managed it. She brought it back down. She filed the flare as information. This is what it feels like. Remember the shape of it. Use it later. Not now. "The prince," she said. "Adrian Evermont. His operation has been running for 14 months. Has he found this?" Brast hesitated. The hesitation was not long, but it was specific. The hesitation of a man who is about to tell a truth that costs him something. "He has found most of it. The Vithar angle was the most recent development. His staff member, who went to the senior council with the Vithar angle. Yes. Which means the Emperor knows. The Emperor has known for 8 days that his director of intelligence constructed a fabricated noble scandal to create the legal predicate for a territorial absorption." She looked at Brast. He looked at her. In the morning light of the cell, with the falcon on the floor between them, the silence had the quality of a room after something structural has broken. The particular stillness of a space reorganizing itself around new load-bearing facts. "What does the Emperor do about his director of intelligence?" she said. That is a question that determines everything." She did not raise her voice. Raising her voice was a resource she was not going to spend here. If the Emperor manages this quietly, removes Voss without public acknowledgement, absorbs the operation into the court's general classified history, resolves the charges against me through private procedure, then the record shows nothing. I am released on a technicality. No public exposure, no accountability. And in 6 months, the intelligence community constructs a different mechanism for the same objective. Brass said nothing. I need it to be public, she said. Lady Ashcombe, I need the charges to be publicly reversed. I need the evidence fabrication to be formally entered into the court record. I need Voss's role to be part of the documented reversal, not a classified annex that gets sealed and filed in the archive that Morn is the only person brave enough to actually read. She looked at him steadily. The Emperor wants minimum damage to the imperial court's structural integrity. I am telling you that the minimum damage outcome is not the private management outcome. The minimum damage outcome is the one where the court demonstrates that it can correct itself visibly, which is the only demonstration that prevents the next Voss from attempting the same architecture on a different target. Brast was quiet for a long time. The morning light had moved past the falcon now and was climbing the far wall. You're asking for the convocation, he said. 3 weeks, in front of the same audience, with the Crown Prince present. The Crown Prince's own investigation has been… Brast stopped. Compromised by the breach in his staff, she finished. Yes, which is why he needs the convocation too. Because a prince whose private investigation was leaked to the senior council is a prince who needs a public vindication as badly as I do. Something moved in Brast's expression. She did not have enough information to name it precisely, but she filed its shape. It was the expression of a man who has just realized that the person he thought he was managing the situation is the person who has, at some point in the last 2 minutes, become the manager of it. I'll convey your position, he said. I'd like more than a conveyance. What would you like? I would like the Emperor's written confirmation that the public convocation resolution is the selected course of action, delivered to me here before the end of this week. I would like Corrin's evidence challenge to remain active and formally docketed regardless of the Directorate's jurisdictional claim, which is procedurally achievable under Court Rule 41 if the Emperor exercises his right of case oversight. She kept her voice level. And I would like to know where Captain Hale is. Brass stood from the bench. He smoothed the front of his coat in the automatic gesture of a man reclaiming his physical dignity after sitting on a prison bench. He looked at her for a moment in the way he'd been looking at her periodically throughout the conversation, measuring something, she wasn't sure what, some quality he'd been revising upward at intervals as the conversation progressed. Hale is in a protected house in the Metavar district, he said. He is injured but ambulatory. He is aware of the Vithara angle. Is he aware of the staff breach? He became aware this morning. She thought about Rowan learning this morning, waking up in a protected house in the Metavar district, still recovering from whatever had been done to him, and being told that the person who had put the falcon in her hand and told her the Crown Prince was moving had turned around 3 days later and walked into the senior counsel's offices with the prince's case files. She thought about what that felt like, and then she stopped thinking about it because thinking about what things felt like was not what the next 3 weeks required. Tell him to stay where he is, she said. Tell him nothing changes. Brast moved toward the door. He stopped, without turning. The staff member, the person who breached the prince's operation. A pause. It was not for money. She waited. It was done because the person in question received documentation suggesting that Captain Hale and you were, in fact, engaged in the conduct described in the charges. He turned halfway. Fabricated documentation, produced by the Directorate specifically to fracture the prince's investigation at the critical point. The person who brought the information to the senior council believed they were doing the right thing. She stood with this for 3 seconds. The Directorate had not just constructed a case against her. It had constructed a parallel operation inside the Crown Prince's own investigation, had watched the investigation develop, identified the person most likely to act on compromising information about Hale, and fed them exactly the material needed to produce a betrayal that looked like conscience. It was, she thought, almost elegant. In the way that things built to destroy were sometimes elegant, complete, structural, without waste. Voss was not a man who left loose ends. He was a man who converted loose ends into additional architecture. Tell the Emperor, she said, that I understand the scope of what was built, and that I intend to take it apart with the same thoroughness. Brast left. The guards left. The door closed. She stood in the center of the cell and looked at the floor where the morning light had been and was now gone. And she thought about the person who had pressed the falcon through the wall and told her she was not alone, and then 3 days later had carried a file into the senior council's chambers because they had been given a lie that looked enough like the truth to act on. She thought about Rowan reading that documentation this morning, his face when he read it. She knew Rowan's face well enough to construct the reading accurately. The initial response, which would be a very specific kind of controlled stillness, the kind that Rowan produced when something hit close enough to the thing he was protecting that the protection required conscious effort. Then the realization that it was fabricated. Then the other realization that the fabrication had been targeted at someone specific, which meant the directorate had mapped the prince's operation thoroughly enough to identify its most vulnerable point. The most vulnerable point of any operation built on trust was always the same: a person who trusted. She picked up the falcon from the floor, turned it once in her fingers. The wings were fully extended, head turned toward the horizon. She thought about the 3 weeks remaining and the architecture she'd been building, the counterstructure, the evidence threads, the convocation as stage, and she ran it now against the new blueprint, the one that showed Voss underneath everything. And she found the places where the structure still held, and the places where the new information had compromised load-bearing walls. The ink compound still held. Morn's find was real, documented, in Corin's formal challenge. Holt's handwriting on the authorization still held, and was now additionally significant because Holt's identity as a directorate agent meant the authorization connected the fabrication not to Cedric's personal operation, but to the intelligence infrastructure. The witness structure, Hersworth, Holt, Voss's niece, still held as evidence of fabrication, and was now additionally significant because one of the 3 witnesses was the director's direct family relation, which was the kind of specific detail that court records tended to highlight. What had been compromised was the prince's clean position. He had been running an unauthorized operation, and the breach of it meant the court now knew this, and managing Adrian Evermont's institutional vulnerability alongside her own legal situation was a more complex problem than the one she'd been working on before Brast arrived. She needed to see the prince, not through intermediaries, not through walls, not through staff members whose loyalty had been tested by fabricated evidence and found, through no fault of their own, inadequate to the test. She needed to sit across from Adrian Evermont and have a direct conversation about what each of them needed and what each of them had, and whether the intersection of those two things was sufficient to produce, in 3 weeks, a public reversal that was clean enough to hold. This was not a request she could make through Brast. She turned the falcon over in her hand and looked at the underside of the wings, which was where, she now noticed for the first time, something had been scratched into the metal in very small, very careful letters. Not engraving, not official marking, something done with a sharp point in a hurry or in low light, the letters slightly uneven but legible. She held the falcon to the window light and read what was scratched there. It was an address, not in the Imperial District, not anywhere near the palace. A street address in the Verath quarter, which was the city's oldest residential neighborhood, the part of the capital that had been there before the Empire formally organized itself around it. The part that still had buildings that predated imperial architecture and streets that hadn't been renamed when the Empire renamed everything. An address in the Verath quarter scratched into the underside of a brass falcon's wings. Scratched there, she understood immediately, before the contact through the wall. Scratched there when the falcon was given to whoever had pressed it through the gap. Scratched by someone who had anticipated that the contact through the wall might be compromised, might not be the last word, might need to be followed up through a channel that did not involve any of the people currently known to any of the parties involved. Scratched there by someone who had been running a very long game and had built into the operation's architecture. A door that opened only when every other door had been closed. The address existed. She memorized it in 4 seconds and did not look at it again. She pressed the falcon into the seam of her skirt's inner hem, where the fabric was doubled and stitched, and worked it through the gap until it sat against the bone of her hip. Invisible, flat, no profile against the fabric from the outside. Then she sat on the bench. 3 weeks. Brast was going to the Emperor. Corin's challenge was docketed. Hale was in Metavar, ambulatory, aware. The convocation was 3 weeks away, and Cedric was going to walk into that room with Selena Vale and the court's full attendance, and not one person in it currently knew what was going to happen next. She thought about Cedric, not about the betrayal. The betrayal had been processed and filed and was in the locked room, in the category of things that were known and had been paid for and no longer required active management. She thought about him specifically, his competence, his planning, the architecture he had participated in, whether he had built it or been handed it, the specific quality of his intelligence, which was real, and which he had always given its full due, even in the worst of the marriage's worst years, because failing to accurately assess an adversary's capability was the error that killed operations. He was smart. He had access. He was currently operating from a position of apparent victory. The Duchess removed, the charges progressing, the spring convocation 3 weeks away, where he intended to formalize, through Selena's presence at his side, the transition that the court had already been prepared to accept. He did not know that Brast had been in her cell. He did not know that Morn had found the authorization document. He did not know, could not know, because the Directorate's internal operations were classified above Cedric's clearance level, that the jurisdictional claim the Directorate had filed to protect Holt's document had been filed in a way that, under Court Rule 41, the Emperor could override. He did not know about the address scratched into the falcon's wings. She thought about all the things Cedric did not know, and she thought about the relationship between what a person doesn't know and what they're willing to do, and she thought about the specific, dangerous overconfidence that settles into a person who has executed a plan and watched it work, and is now managing the aftermath with the relaxed attention of someone who believes the hard part is over. Cedric believed the hard part was over. It was the one mistake she needed. She had it. The cell was 8 by 10 feet, and had been for 11 days and would be for 17 more, and she sat in it with her back straight and the falcon against her hip, and the address in her memory, and the fury banked exactly as low as it needed to be, and she began constructing the final version of what she was going to build. Not the version she'd been constructing before Brast arrived. The version that had assumed the enemy was Cedric, that assumed the operation's scope was personal, that assumed the Crown Prince's clean position was an asset rather than a complication. That version was gone, and she did not mourn it because mourning versions of things was another resource she was not going to spend. The new version was harder. It required exposing not just Cedric, but Voss, not just the fabricated charges, but the Directorate's role in them, not just the personal betrayal, but the institutional architecture that had made the personal betrayal possible and useful. It required doing this at the convocation, in public, in front of the Emperor himself, in a way that was legally sufficient, evidentially airtight, and politically survivable for the prince, for Corin, for Morn, for Pell, for every person who had taken a risk in the past 11 days on the basis of believing that the truth, exposed correctly, was stronger than the machinery built to bury it. It required her to be something she had spent 12 years carefully not being in the presence of powerful men, completely, visibly, undisguisably dangerous. She had spent 12 years making herself smaller so Cedric could feel larger. She was done with that particular practice. The morning was gone from the cell. The afternoon light came through the high window at a different angle, hitting the east wall instead of the floor, illuminating a section of stone that she had catalogued 11 days ago and had not found remarkable. She found it remarkable now. Because in the afternoon light, at this specific angle, she could see for the first time what the seeping moisture had done to the stone over what must have been decades or generations. It had carved a shape into the surface, slow and patient and entirely without intent. A shape that was not a shape, just erosion taking its natural course, water finding the path of least resistance through rock. She looked at it for a while. Then she stopped looking at it and went back to work. She was still working, still building, still calculating, still running every angle of the thing she was going to do at the convocation, when the slot opened at dusk and Pell's voice came through it, and Pell's voice was wrong in a way she recognized immediately. Too careful, too neutral, the voice of a young man who has just learned something and is managing the learning badly. "There's a message," he said. "From who?" A pause. "Someone left it at the outer gate. No name." He slid a folded paper through the lower hatch. She picked it up. No envelope. No seal. A single sheet folded twice. She opened it. 2 lines of handwriting she had never seen before but recognized the register of. The handwriting of someone educated in the old court style, which was a style taught only in the families of the empire's original 30 noble houses. "The emperor will not choose the convocation. He has chosen containment. You have 4 days before the charges are formalized into a conviction without trial on grounds of confession." She read it twice. Grounds of confession. She had not confessed. She had said nothing at the arraignment beyond the questions she'd put to Voss, nothing in 11 days of custody that could be characterized as admission. There was no confession, which meant someone was going to produce one, which meant someone had access to the court's record-keeping mechanism sufficient to insert a document that did not exist, which was a different order of fabrication than letters and witnesses, that was institutional architecture, that required someone inside the clerk's record office, or someone with authority over it, or someone who had been anticipating the need for it since before the operation began. 4 days, not 3 weeks. 4 days. She stood in the cell with the paper in her hand, and she felt the new shape of things, the accelerated timeline, the closed door of the convocation option, the confession that was going to appear in a record somewhere and formalize her destruction before the ink compound and the authorization document and Corin's challenge could complete their slow, legitimate process through the court's apparatus. She felt all of this with complete clarity, and she felt it as the thing it was. The point past which the tools she had been using were no longer sufficient for the situation they were being used on. She had been building a legal countercase, a structural argument, a public reversal predicated on the legitimate functioning of the court's own mechanisms. The court's own mechanisms had just been removed from the table. She held the paper in both hands and looked at it and thought about who had sent it and what they had risked sending it and what they were telling her to do by telling her the door was closing, and she arrived at the same answer every time. They were not telling her to give up. They were telling her that the way out was not going to be through any door that was already in the wall. She was going to have to make a door. She thought about what she was willing to do, not as a moral examination, not here, not in 4 days, but as a practical inventory. What she had, what she knew, what she could reach from inside the cell in 4 days, what she was willing to use and how far she was willing to go in using it. She thought about the address in her memory and the falcon against her hip. She thought about Pell in the corridor. She thought about the 12 years of cataloged information in the locked room, every inconsistency, every lie, every moment she had filed without knowing what she was filing it for, and she thought about how much of that information, properly deployed, was not just evidence for a court case, but leverage. Direct, personal, targeted leverage over specific individuals who had specific things to lose. She had spent 12 years being the kind of woman who didn't use what she knew to hurt people. She looked at the paper in her hands. 4 days. She folded it precisely along its original creases, and she looked at the fold lines for a moment, and she made the decision, not slowly, not with the slow weight of a moral reckoning, but with the quick, cold efficiency of a woman who has just been told the house is on fire and has 4 minutes to get everyone out, and the door is locked, and she is holding the key. "Pell," she said. His voice came immediately, which meant he'd been standing close. "Ma'am, I need to get out of this cell tonight." A silence so long she could hear the prison breathing around it. The pipes, the distant doors, the accumulated sound of a building that had been holding people down for a very long time. Then, "I know." She stopped. "I know," he said again, and his voice was different than it had ever been. Not the careful neutral of a young man managing a prohibited interaction, but something stripped of the management entirely, something that had been waiting under the surface of 11 days of silence and extra water and a folded newspaper, something that sounded with a clarity that hit her somewhere below the level of calculation, like someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had been waiting for the moment when it became necessary. "The east wall gap," she said. "Who is on the other side of this building right now?" "Someone who's been waiting," Pell said, "since yesterday." She picked up the falcon from her hip. She was not the same woman who had stood near the south colonnade 11 days ago in a gown the color of winter water, holding a champagne glass, watching her husband watch another woman and calculating the math of her own destruction. That woman had been careful, had been controlled, had been the product of 12 years of making herself manageable. That woman had been destroyed as planned. What remained, what was standing in an 8x10 cell with a brass falcon in her fist, and 4 days before a forged confession formalized the end of her name, her family's land, and every person who had taken a risk on her behalf, was something that had been in the locked room all along, filed away, not yet named, waiting for the moment when every other option had been removed. And the only thing left was to open the door and let it out. She looked at the high window, dark now, winter dark, the specific black that came after the last of the gray. "Tonight," she said. Not a question. "Tonight," Pell said. And the lock on the cell door began very quietly to move. The lock moved for 4 seconds before it caught. A small metallic hesitation, the mechanism working against itself the way old locks did when the key was slightly wrong or the hand holding it was slightly unsteady. And then it opened, and the door swung inward, and Pell stood in the threshold with the specific expression of a man who has crossed a line and is already past the point of questioning whether the crossing was correct. He was 23 years old. She had revised his age downward over 11 days of listening to his footsteps and his voice and the particular quality of his silences. 23 River Province, the son of someone who had taught him that integrity was not a performance. She could read this in him the way you read certain things in people when you have nothing to do but pay attention. He was afraid. She could see the fear in the set of his jaw and the way his hands were managing themselves, deliberately still at his sides in the posture of someone who has decided that stillness is the only thing standing between them and visible panic. She did not say thank you. Thank you was the wrong word for what he had just done, which was not a favor. "East wall," she said quietly. "How?" "There's a service passage," he said. "Maintenance access for the water pipes. It runs parallel to your cell block and exits into the alley on the Varath side. It's not on the official building schematic because it predates the prison's construction. It was part of the original building when this was a grain warehouse 200 years ago. Who else knows about it?" "The maintenance workers. And one other guard. Soren, night rotation, east wing. He's—" Pell stopped. "He's going to be occupied for the next 40 minutes. She did not ask what occupied meant. She moved to the door, looked into the corridor. Empty. The specific emptiness of a building in its lowest attention hour. That window between the last scheduled check and the first indication of dawn when institutional alertness dropped to its minimum. And she stepped out of the cell. The corridor was colder than the cell. This surprised her slightly. 11 days had calibrated her body to the cell's specific temperature, and the corridor felt, by comparison, like the outside of something, which was what it was. The outside of a container she'd been inside long enough for it to feel like a location rather than a confinement. She noted the surprise, filed it, moved. Pell led her left, away from the main cell block, toward a section of corridor she hadn't mapped by sound because sound didn't travel well through the thickness of the wall that separated this section from the rest. He stopped at a section of wall that looked identical to every other section of wall and pressed his palm against a specific stone, the fourth from the floor, second from the left of a vertical seam, and the stone moved inward 1/2 inch. And a section of wall, the width of a man's shoulders, swung silently on a mechanism that had been maintained by someone who valued silence in mechanisms. The passage beyond it was not dark. Someone had placed a lamp inside, turned very low, the flame at its minimum viable point, enough to move by, not enough to be visible for more than a few feet. She went in. Pell followed. The wall closed behind them. The passage smelled of water and old stone and the specific organic quality of spaces that have been closed for long periods and occasionally reopened. It was narrow enough that she moved with one shoulder brushing the left wall, oriented sideways to keep her profile minimal. Above her, the pipes were visible. Old iron, sweating condensation. The arteries of the prison's water supply running directly overhead in the way of buildings that had been adapted from one purpose to another without full architectural reconciliation. She counted her steps. 43 paces to the first turn, left. 31 paces to a section where the ceiling dropped and she had to duck, which she did without slowing. Another 19 paces and the passage widened slightly and she could smell something different. Not prison, not waterstone, but night air. Winter-specific, carrying the particular cold of a city at 3 a.m. when the fires have burned low and the streets have emptied, and the air belongs, briefly, to no one. A door. Iron, not wood. Old iron, pitted with age, with a bar latch rather than a lock. She lifted the bar and pushed, and the door opened into an alley so narrow that standing in it put her within arm's reach of both walls simultaneously. She stood in the alley and breathed. The air hit her face with the force of something physical. 11 days of stone and iron, and the recycled breath of a building designed to hold people exchanged in one inhale for the open city. The winter sky above the alley showing a strip of deep blue black with 2 stars visible through the gap between roof lines. She gave herself 3 seconds of this. Not sentiment. Her body needed the recalibration, needed to update its understanding of where it was. And 3 seconds was the minimum sufficient time. Then she looked at the address in her memory and turned right. Pell had not followed her out. She had not expected him to follow her out. He had opened the door. What came after was not his architecture to navigate, and both of them understood this without discussing it. She would not see him again, probably. If Voss's operation was as thorough as it had demonstrated being, Pell's role in her exit would be identified and he would face consequences for it. She had weighed this against what would happen to Pell and every other person in the Empire's institutional machinery if the fabricated confession was allowed to stand and the Vithara territories were absorbed on its back, had weighed it and arrived at the accounting that every person who chose to act on conscience in the vicinity of power arrived at eventually. The cost was real, and the refusal to pay it was also a cost. And one of those 2 costs was recoverable, and the other was not. She moved through the Vareth quarter at the pace of someone who knows where they're going, which was the only pace that didn't generate attention in a city at 3 in the morning. The quarter's streets were exactly as old as the buildings that lined them, uneven, unpredictable, laid out on the logic of 2 centuries ago when the Empire's concept of urban planning had been considerably more organic than it subsequently became. She navigated by the address she'd memorized and by the mental map of the city she'd been building for 12 years of residence in the capital, a map that was detailed in the districts that mattered and had now, suddenly, become detailed in the district that mattered most. The building was 3 stories. Stone, like everything in the Vareth quarter, but stone of a different era than the prison. Older, better cut, with the kind of facade that had been repaired so many times across so many decades that the repairs were part of the architecture now, the building's history written in its patchwork. No insignia, no visible identifying mark. A door with an iron knocker shaped like a hand, which was a detail she noted as deliberate because someone had chosen it, and choices in the details of unremarkable buildings were never accidental. She knocked 3 times. Waited. Knocked twice. The door opened after approximately 30 seconds, not the hesitation of someone awakened, but the pause of someone who had been awake and waiting and was calibrating the exact right moment to open the door. A woman, 60 years old, gray hair, the kind of face that had stopped performing anything for anyone a long time ago and was now simply itself. She looked at Vivian without surprise. "You're late," she said. "I was in prison." "I know where you were." The woman stepped back. "Come in." The interior was warm. After 11 days of stone cold and prison temperature, the warmth was almost disorienting. She felt it in her hands first, then her face, then the slow release of something in her shoulders that she hadn't realized was held. A fire in a grate. 2 lamps, a table with papers on it, organized in the specific way of someone who uses papers as thinking tools rather than filing systems, spread, annotated, cross-referenced. And at the far end of the table, standing with his back to the fire, arms crossed, looking at her with the expression of someone who has been managing an enormous amount of information for a very long time, and has just reached the point where managing it alone is no longer viable. Crown Prince Adrian Evermont. He was younger than she'd expected, which was the first thought she had, and she filed it immediately because it was irrelevant. 28, which she knew, but knowing and seeing were different calibrations. He had the Evermont features, the angular jaw, the dark eyes, the particular quality of bearing that the imperial family had been selecting for across generations, until it became structural rather than performed. He also had the look of a man who had not slept in several days, which was the look she probably also had, and which created, between them, a kind of immediate parity that a formal meeting in a formal context would not have produced. "Vivian Ashcombe," he said. "Your Highness." She did not bow, which was technically a breach of protocol, and which they both understood she was not going to perform in this room at 3 in the morning after 11 days in a cell. He did not react to it. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He sat across from her. The older woman, who had not introduced herself and whom Vivian had already categorized as the operation's institutional memory, the person who knew where everything was and how everything connected and whose continued anonymity was a structural requirement rather than a social preference, moved to the edge of the room and became background. "My father has chosen containment," Adrian said. "I know. Brass told you. Brass told me the direction. The note tonight told me the timeline. Adrian looked at her. 4 days. 3.5 now. He put his hands flat on the table. They were not entirely steady, which was interesting. The hands of a man whose controlled exterior was costing him something at the level where hands told the truth. Voss has a confession document prepared, dated today 3 of your custody. It will be entered into the official record the morning of the 4th day, and the formal conviction will be processed within 6 hours. Standard accelerated procedure for confessed noble conduct violations. He paused. My father knows the confession is fabricated. He has chosen to accept it as the resolution because the alternative, a public exposure of the directorate's role, creates an institutional wound he is not willing to sustain. He is protecting Voss. He is protecting the directorate. Voss is the mechanism. Adrian's jaw tightened. My father built the current intelligence structure over 30 years. Voss has run it for 14 of them. Exposing the operation against you means exposing the methods, and the methods have been applied in other contexts, against other targets, for reasons that the Emperor believes justified the architecture, even when specific applications of it were— He stopped. Criminal, she said. Irregular, he said, which was not agreement but was not disagreement either, and was the most Adrian Evermont was going to say about his father in a room with a lamp and a fire and a woman he'd never met. She looked at him. The firelight moved across the table between them. She was thinking about what she had learned in 11 days and in the 2 years before that. The slow, accumulated understanding of how power worked at the level where the machinery was visible, how it protected itself, how it rationalized the protection, how the people inside it learned to distinguish between the institution's survival and their own in ways that served the institution without ever quite acknowledging the service. The Emperor was protecting the Directorate because the Directorate was part of the architecture he had built and believed in, and the architecture was real and had real functions, and the fact that it had been used to destroy an innocent woman for territorial acquisition was, in the Emperor's calculation, a correctable error at the operational level that did not require structural exposure. She understood this. She understood it completely. She also understood that the Emperor was wrong, not about the Directorate's value, but about the cost of the containment, which was not merely her conviction, but the permanent establishment of a precedent, that imperial intelligence assets could be deployed against nobles, evidence could be fabricated at the institutional level, and the correction mechanism would be private and would leave no record. The next Voss would know this, would use it. You started your investigation 14 months ago, she said. What triggered it? Adrian looked at the table. A woman named Kalis Orn, Baron's daughter, Northern Province, convicted of estate fraud on fabricated evidence. She died in custody 8 months ago. He looked up. The original evidence package had the same signature, same structure, different operation, same architect. Voss built her case too. Voss's office, not directly attributable to him personally. The same problem as yours. A pause. She didn't have anyone looking. The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. She thought about Kalis Orn, a name she had never heard, a woman who had died in a cell not unlike the one she'd just come from, and she thought about the relationship between having someone looking and surviving, how thin that line was, how completely it depended on accidents of proximity and loyalty, and the specific willingness of specific people to spend their own safety on someone else's survival. She thought about Pell, about Morn, about Ashby in the corridor with 4 minutes before the rotation, about the person whose name she still did not know who had pressed a falcon through a gap in a prison wall and told her she was not alone, and who had then, 3 days later, been handed a lie and acted on it with the terrible good faith of someone who had not yet learned that good faith was the first thing institutional power learned to imitate. She thought about all the people who had spent something on her behalf, and she thought about what she was going to spend it on. I need the original evidence package, she said. The full package, not the court summary. Every document in it. I have it. I need the Directorate's internal communications regarding the Vithara operation, whatever your investigation has collected. I have most of it. The deepest layer is still encrypted. I need Hale. Hale is some— I know where Hale is. I need him here or somewhere accessible before dawn. She looked at Adrian directly. And I need you to understand that what I'm going to do with these things is not going to be managed or contained or presented to your father in advance for approval. I am going to take everything I have to the spring convocation, and I am going to lay it on the floor of that room in front of every noble house in the empire and the emperor himself. And the outcome of that will be whatever the truth produces when it is exposed to that specific audience with that specific power to act on it. Adrian held her gaze. That is a complete destruction of institutional discretion. Yes. It exposes my father's knowledge of Voss's methods. It exposes the minimum necessary to make the reversal irreversible. I am not interested in destroying your father's reign. I am interested in making it impossible for this to be done again. She leaned forward slightly. The distinction is real, and I am asking you to trust it. He was quiet. The fire shifted behind him, and the light moved across his face, and she watched him think. Watched the thinking happen visibly, which was not something most powerful men allowed, which suggested either that he was too tired to manage the performance, or that he had made a decision some time before she arrived that the performance was not what this required. My investigation has been compromised, he said. My staff, the breach. I know. Then you know that anything I bring to the convocation will be framed as the product of an unauthorized operation whose security was insufficient to protect its own sources. Yes, which is why what I bring to the convocation cannot be framed as the product of your investigation. She held his gaze. The evidence has to come through the court's legitimate record. Corin's challenge, Morn's documentation, the authorization original, entered through proper channels, reviewed and certified before the convocation date. She paused. What you provide is presence. When I lay this in front of the empire, I need the crown prince standing in that room as witness, not as prosecutor. The prosecution is already built. I need the weight of your position as confirmation that what is being exposed with the full knowledge and endorsement of the succession. Something in Adrian Evermont's expression shifted. Not dramatically. A small movement, the kind that on a face trained to control itself represented something much larger happening underneath. You've been planning this from the cell. I've been planning this from the ballroom, she said. The cell gave me more time. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile Morn had produced. Fast, controlled. The expression of someone who has learned to keep that particular response private. Then it was gone, and he was back to the flat. Direct attention that she was beginning to understand was his baseline, the face underneath the performance of authority rather than the performance itself. Corin needs protection, he said. If Voss identifies the evidence challenge as a live threat, Corin needs to be in the convocation hall when the challenge is read into the formal record. Public exposure is his protection, the same exposure that is mine. She looked at him. That is the architecture. Everything happens at the convocation. In public, simultaneously. Nothing can be quietly managed if it all surfaces at the same moment. The older woman at the edge of the room made a small sound. Not speech, just breath. The sound of someone who has been listening and has reached a specific point in their listening. Vivian looked at her. The woman looked back with the eyes of someone who has spent a long time studying how operations run and has just heard something about the structure of one that she is assessing. She gave a single, small nod. Not to Vivian. To Adrian. Adrian looked back at Vivian. There are 3 days between now and the convocation. You cannot be in the capital. If Voss's people locate you before the convocation, the confession document enters the record under emergency accelerated procedure, and the convocation appearance becomes irrelevant. He pushed a folded paper across the table. There is a house in the Metavar district. Where Hale is. Where Hale is. You will be brought there before dawn. You will remain there until the morning of the convocation. You will have access to everything my investigation has collected, and you will have 3 days to make it court-ready. He looked at her without softening anything. If it fails, if the evidence is insufficient, or Voss moves faster than we've calculated, or my father exercises his imperial override before the convocation proceedings can begin, then everything we've done surfaces regardless, and none of the people who helped you have any institutional protection. I know, she said. I need you to say it back to me, he said. Not because I think you don't understand it, because I need to have heard it said. She looked at him. If this fails, everyone who helped me loses their protection and faces Voss's response. I know this. I'm going to make sure it doesn't fail. That's not a guarantee. No, it isn't. She held his gaze. Nothing I can say to you is a guarantee. What I can tell you is that I have been in a cell for 11 days with nothing but time, and the most comprehensive picture of this operation's architecture that any civilian has ever been in a position to construct. I know where every seam is. I know where the evidence is thinnest and where it is airtight. I know which witnesses are untouchable and which ones will fracture under formal questioning. I know exactly what this looks like when it's laid in front of 200 noble houses and an emperor who has known for 8 days that his director of intelligence committed a crime and chose to absorb it rather than expose it. She paused. I know what that room does with that information. I have been watching that room work for 12 years. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. I'll have Hale told to expect you. The older woman at the edge of the room moved to the table and began assembling papers into an ordered stack with the efficiency of someone packing for a journey they have been preparing for some time. The papers were the investigation's documentation. She could see Corin's challenge at the top, and beneath it the layered architecture of 14 months of work. She stood and the standing cost her less than it had cost her in the cell, which was the body updating itself in real time to new information about what was required of it. She took the stack from the older woman's hands. One more thing, she said to Adrian, who had moved toward the fire and was standing with his back to it again, hands in his coat pockets now. The posture of a man who is committed to a course of action and is managing the weight of the commitment. The person who breached your operation. He went very still. They acted in good faith, she said, on fabricated evidence that was designed specifically to produce the breach it produced. That design is documented. The existence of the false materials, the targeting of a specific individual's known vulnerability, the timing calibrated to fracture your operation at its critical point. She held the stack of papers. That needs to be part of the record, not as a footnote, as a primary document. Adrian looked at the fire. A long moment. Why? Because the record needs to show not just what was done to me, but the method, the completeness of it, the fact that the operation was designed to compromise every point of resistance simultaneously, including your investigation, including its people. She looked at him. The record needs to show that this was a machine, not a man with a grudge. A machine, and machines of that kind don't get built once. He was quiet. Then, it will be in the record. She walked toward the door. The older woman opened it before she reached it, and the night came in again. The 3 in the morning city, the narrow Verath streets, the winter air that had her name in it now, that she had the right to be standing in. A carriage was waiting in the alley. Plain. No insignia. The same deliberate anonymity as before, but different in the specific way that things were different when you were on the other side of them. She got in. The carriage moved through the Verath quarter, and then through streets she tracked by sound and angle, and the landmarks she had memorized over 12 years of living in this city. Medivar was 20 minutes east, on the riverside, a district of middle-level commerce and residential buildings that had the social function of invisibility, not poor enough to attract attention from the city's charitable institutions, and not rich enough to attract attention from its power networks. She sat in the carriage with the papers on her lap and the falcon against her hip, and she thought about the 3 days she had. 3 days to convert 14 months of investigation documentation into a court presentation that was legally airtight, evidentially comprehensive, and structured for the specific audience of the spring convocation, 200 noble houses, an emperor, and the full institutional weight of the imperial court's public record. 3 days to build the case that Corin's formal challenge had opened the door to, but had not yet entered. 3 days to do what a full legal team operating through legitimate procedure would have needed 6 months to construct. She had done harder things in worse circumstances with less. She thought about this, and did not find it comforting and did not look for comfort in it. It was simply a fact about her capability, assessed as accurately as she could assess it, which was the only assessment that mattered. The carriage stopped. The door opened. The street was quiet. A residential block, 3 stories of stone on each side. A lamp burning at the corner with the low flame of one that had been burning since evening and had not been tended. A building, middle of the block, with a door that opened before she reached it. And in the doorway, one arm braced against the frame because the standing required the brace, dressed in civilian clothes that did not fit him the way his uniform had fit him because no clothes fit Rowan Hale the way his uniform did. Rowan. He looked at her for approximately 2 seconds with the expression of a man who had been maintaining a very specific quality of controlled stillness for the entire duration of her imprisonment, and had just been released from the requirement. "You're out," he said. "I'm out." "You look—" He stopped. "Like someone who spent 11 days in a cell." "I was going to say like someone who just won an argument." He moved aside to let her in, and the moving required effort she could see but that he declined to acknowledge. His color was wrong, the particular pallor of someone recovering from something internal, the kind that didn't show on the surface the way wounds showed but ran deeper and took longer. She looked at him and looked away because looking too directly at what had been done to him was not useful to either of them right now, and both of them knew it. "How functional are you?" she said. "Functional enough." "That's not a number." 70%. He looked at her directly. "What do you need?" 3 days, she said. "And everything you remember about the night they moved you." He led her into the building, which was warm the way the Verith house had been warm, which she was still calibrating to, and she set the papers on a table and she looked at him across it and he looked at her across it, and 3 days of everything she had to say to him and everything he had to say to her existed in the space between them, and neither of them said any of it. "The forged evidence they used against us," she said. "The materials they gave to the prince's staff. You saw them?" Something moved in his jaw. "This morning. I need you to tell me everything in them that was specifically calibrated to produce that response in that person. Every detail they got right, every detail they got wrong." She held his eyes. "Because those details tell us exactly how deep the surveillance ran and exactly which of Voss's people were close enough to construct that specific picture." Rowan sat down at the table. His hands were flat on the wood, which she recognized as the same deliberate management of unsteadiness that she had seen in Adrian Evermont's hands, which was the physical signature of people who had been running on controlled fury for too long. "How much time before they know you're out?" "Pell will be identified by morning shift change, 6 hours, maybe 7. Then Voss will move up the confession documents timeline." "Yes," she sat across from him, "which is why the next 6 hours matter more than the following 60. He looked at her with the eyes that were the same as they'd always been. The eyes that had been in the room with her, and with the operation, and with everything that had happened since the ballroom, that had not gone soft and had not gone cold, but had stayed themselves through everything that had been done to him, which she found, in some locked part of herself, more affecting than she had resources to properly respond to. "Tell me what you need," he said. She opened the top paper in the stack, and they began. The 6 hours ran at the pace of 6 hours in which every minute had a specific function assigned to it. Rowan's testimony about the night of the transfer, the details of how the operation against the prince's staff had been constructed, the cross-referencing of his account against the documentation in Adrian's files, the identification of the surveillance signatures that told them which specific members of Voss's network had been deployed in which positions and for how long. The fire burned down, and Rowan rebuilt it without interrupting the work. The city outside moved through the last hour of its deepest quiet, and then began the slow process of waking, the sounds of early commerce coming through the walls, bakers and river workers, and the specific acoustic signature of a city resuming itself. She worked, and she thought, and she built. By the time the first light came through the window, she had the structure, not finished. 3 days from finished, with pieces still requiring Corin's formal certification and Morn's documentation, and Adrian's presence at the convocation as the weight that converted evidence into verdict. But the structure was there, complete, load-bearing at every point. She could see it the way you could see a building after the framing was up. The rooms not yet enclosed, the surfaces not yet applied, but the bones of it correct and sufficient and standing. Rowan was looking at the papers spread across the table with the expression of a man who had been tracking the architecture of the thing as it was built and had just seen it become recognizably whole. "It works," he said. "It works if we have 3 days. We have 3 days. We have 3 days if Voss doesn't—" "Vivian." He looked at her directly. The use of her name without title, without the careful social management that even people who knew her well defaulted to in professional contexts, just her name, in his voice, with the specific weight of a man who has been thinking about a specific person for 11 days and is now in a room with that person and is not going to pretend otherwise. "It works. You built it." She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the window at an angle that caught the papers and made them bright, and she thought about what it had taken to get here. Every person who had spent something, every risk that had been taken, every moment she had pressed against the bruise and not made the sound. She thought about Kalis Orn, who had died in a cell because no one was looking.